Chapter 1. The cards hit the table in a rhythmic slap, 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 which always made Wyatt Cauldron's blood pound. This was just a friendly game, between him and his best friend, Jax, alone in Wyatt's little apartment above the racetrack, but he couldn't deny the way the excitement of a card game made his hands clammy, and his heart beat faster. Even though his friend insisted there would be no betting. Jax Weston finished dealing and settled back in his chair with a smirk. "You ready?" Wyatt's lips twitched. "You sure you don't want to make this game a little more interesting?" His best friend snorted softly and hooked one arm around the back of the chair. "I quit betting on games with you a long time ago, man. You think I'm stupid? Hey, card playing is just as much luck as it is skill." Jax rolled his eyes. "It's your luck I'm worried about. Your skill can go suck an egg as far as I'm concerned. I was always the better card player, but somehow." "You think you're better than me?" Wyatt leaned forward, sensing a chance for a wager. But his friend didn't take the bait. "I know it, but if I make the claim, and you bet me on it, we'll be back in the same place we are now." Jax nodded to the pile of cards. "So just pick up your dang hand, and let's get this game going." Smirking, Wyatt leaned back in his chair and reached for his hand. "Can't blame a guy for trying," he muttered, fanning out his cards. "Yes, I can," his friend snapped from across the table. Wyatt didn't look up as he grinned. The 3 of clubs. The 4 of hearts. The 5 of hearts. The Jack of spades. The King of spades. Are you sure you don't want?" "Shut up, Wyatt. I'm strategizing." Chuckling, Wyatt pinched his cards closed once more and tapped them together on the cheap vinyl tablecloth he'd thrown over the folding table, which served as his dining room, workspace, and occasional card-playing table. The tablecloth was emblazoned with horses, of course. Wyatt might have been something of the black sheep in the family, but he was still a Cauldron. Sure, he'd moved out at an early age and still preferred to live alone. Sure, the family's notorious luck had manifested itself differently when it came to him, but he was still a Cauldron, and he still busted his butt every day to make the family ranch a success. Even if he did it a bit differently than his brothers and cousins. He and Cade and Decker were triplets. Cade was the ranch's nutritionist, who spent his days experimenting with different combinations of feed and supplements to ensure the Caudron Valley ranch's racehorses were the healthiest around. Deck was a leatherworker, and the saddles he made by hand were proven to increase a racehorse's speed. The brothers had 3 cousins, also triplets, who were born the same week as they were. Bob was the ranch's geneticist. Not a pairing was suggested, nor a breeding undertaken, without his extensive research. Jim was the horse whisperer, who could make a horse do just about anything simply by asking politely, and who was also in charge of the training program. Ted was the brains of the operation. He efficiently ran the whole dang ranch and kept track of the spreadsheets and calculations and profits and whatever the heck else was necessary. Their grandfather, who'd raised them all with the help of their now-deceased grandmother, liked to joke there was something in the water which made each of his grandsons incredibly successful at their chosen careers. There wasn't a horse Jim couldn't train, or an equine health problem Cade couldn't improve. And as for Wyatt? Well, there wasn't a wager Wyatt couldn't win. His brothers and cousins had the best luck when it came to their chosen passions, but Wyatt just had the best luck, period. He was the obvious choice to run the family's racetrack and plan the annual races and rodeos. Absolutely anything he wagered on came out to his advantage, which is why his friends and relatives had long given up betting against him. Except recently, when his brothers and cousins had put in $1,000 each, to wager Wyatt would. "Okay, I'm ready," Jax announced. Wyatt tapped his cards against the racehorse tablecloth once more. "Took you long enough." Yeah. I had to run some calculations." Wyatt snorted. "You started last round, so I'm going first, right?" "Be my guest." Smirking once more at his best friend's irritation, Wyatt lifted the cards in his hand again, only fanning them out once they were close enough to his eyes he knew no one else could see them. Not that he thought Jax would cheat, but it was a technique Wyatt had learned long ago at the tables in Las Vegas and Reno, and a half-dozen other casino towns, where he'd run off in his crazy youth to exploit this talent of his. Let's see. The 3 of clubs. The 4 of hearts. The 5 of hearts. The Jack of spades. The King of spades. Nodding, Wyatt met Jax's eyes over the hand and took a deep breath. Do you have any 5s? Jax's ice blue eyes darted down to his hand, and a smile slowly spread across his face. No, he said, with great satisfaction. Go fish. Muttering a curse, Wyatt reached across the table and pulled from the deck. The 7 of diamonds. That didn't help at all. Do you have any 3s? Jax asked, and when Wyatt tossed him the 1 from his hand, Jax crowed with pleasure. Looks like your luck isn't holding out tonight, buddy. Just you wait, Wyatt replied with a growl in his tone. When it was his turn again, Wyatt took a 4, a jack, and a king from Jax in short order, which shut his friend right up. But then he ended up having to pull the next few turns. All in all, it was a relatively short game, and when it was over, Jax went out first. Wyatt had one more set of pairs than his friend did. I'm declaring myself the winner, he announced, as he stood and headed toward the fridge. I was the one who got rid of all my cards first, Jax protested, collecting all the cards and shuffling them. That makes me the winner, Wyatt hummed sarcastically as he reached in to grab a couple cold cans. Clearly you don't know how Go Fish works. You want corn chips? Clearly, I shouldn't play cards with you if you're not going to adhere to the rules. And of course I want corn chips. Wyatt tossed his friend a can and clutched the material of his shirt right above his heart. I can't believe you just accused me of cheating. I can't believe you sucker me into these arguments. Where are the chips? Smiling, Wyatt nodded to the cabinet he used as a pantry. I bought your favorite. Excellent. Jax pushed back his chair and stood. Then I suppose I forgive you. Grinning, Wyatt settled into the beat-up recliner he'd positioned under a window. He'd gotten it used years ago, and it was now so perfectly molded to his butt, he sometimes slept in it. He had a bed in the back bedroom, of course, but he couldn't always be bothered to turn off the TV and head back there. Besides, when he was sitting in his chair, with the comfortable material wrapped around him, he didn't. Well, he didn't feel so alone. With a little grunt, Jax lowered himself on one end of the couch and balanced the bowl of chips in his lap. As he popped open the top of the can, he looked around the room. You know, man, and don't take this the wrong way, but your furniture could use an upgrade. How could I not take that the wrong way? Wyatt gestured with the can. That sofa you're sitting on is almost new. Yeah. It was the best-looking option at the thrift store. Remember? I helped you bring it home. Jax toed his boots off and swung his legs up on the couch. Look around, man. None of your dining room chairs match. That's because they're not a set. That's a folding card table. Exactly. I know this is a small space, but you could totally overhaul it to be, well, nice. You've got the money. His friend was right, Wyatt did have the money. Thanks to his youthful gambling all over creation, and his more recent successes with the racetrack, where each race made the house a tidy sum, even when he wasn't betting his own money, he did have a lot of money. And it was all sitting in the bank, gathering dust, or whatever the virtual equivalent was. Interest? Yeah, that was it, his money was gathering interest, because what else was he going to do with it? But, meh, was all he said, as he gestured to his friend to pass the chips his way. Why bother? Because, Jack said in exasperation, as he handed the bowl over, what would a girl say if you brought her up here? A girl. Wyatt repeated flatly. Yeah, a girl? A lady? A human of the female persuasion, who isn't Griselda? Wyatt pretended to shudder. Man, I wouldn't even bring Griselda up here. She'd try to clean something, but knock something else over, and it'd take me weeks to get everything back to normal. The old lady, his grandfather's housekeeper, had the best of intentions, but was clumsy as all get out. However, she baked like a goddess, and always made his favorite lasagna when he asked, so he'd forgive her for darn near anything. Back to normal? Jack snorted and snatched the chips back. man, you're living like a bum. What did your last date say when you brought her back here? Sir, I'll have you know, I'm a gentleman. Wyatt sniffed, as if offended. I would never bring a date back here. Because you know she'd run off screaming if she saw your mismatched furniture and how none of your cabinet pulls are the same color. Wyatt twisted in his chair to peer across the room at his small kitchen. I can't believe you noticed the color of my cabinet pulls. His friend shrugged. All I'm saying is, you might want to update this place a bit, if you're planning on bringing a date here. Okay, first of all, I don't know why you're so interested in what my dates think of my home. Second, my dates would just end up in the bedroom, so why bother? Stop BSing me, Jax interrupted, then rolled his eyes. You've never brought a date to your bedroom. In fact, you've never brought a date here at all. When was the last time you even had a date? Slowly, Wyatt reached down and pulled the lever beside his chair, forcing the footrest down and the back up, so he was sitting upright. He swallowed. I've had plenty of dates. Jack shook his head. Calling BS again. How would you know? I date plenty. Oh yeah? What was the name of the last lady you took out? The corn chips were sitting uneasily in Wyatt's stomach as he lied to his best friend. I'm not going to kiss and tell, man, not even to you. I've taken out plenty of women, dozens of them, in the last year alone. Jax was right, he was full of BS. At the beginning of the summer, only a few months ago, Pops had sat Wyatt and his brothers and cousins down and told them it was time for them all to get married. Bob and Kate had jumped right on things, marrying within just a week of each another, and were both obviously stupidly happy with their new wives. Jim and Decker and Ted had taken a bit more time, but they had all eventually found and married the women of their dreams as well. Family dinners were getting to be a huge pain in Wyatt's butt, as he had to sit and watch them all be so dongate in love. But not Wyatt. Oh no. Absolutely not. There was no way he was going to fall into that stupid trap and get married to some random woman he'd only just met. Because the only woman he wanted to marry, he couldn't have. He realized he was glaring at the can still in his hand and raised his eyes to find his best friend staring at him. I've never heard you talk about any of these women, Jax said, with a raised brow. Wyatt shrugged. Why should I? He lifted his chin. But I promise you, I could walk downtown tonight and find a lady willing to let me take her out to dinner. His friend burst out chuckling. You're that confident? Wyatt had dated casually throughout the years, plenty of times. When he was in college, he'd done his best to ignore the memories of the one girl he couldn't have, and had made sure to have a different woman on his arm each weekend. Even though his interest in dating serially had waned in recent years, he was certain he could still charm a woman, with no problem. So he nodded. Yeah, I am. And his best friend, knowing him so well, grinned ruthlessly and uttered those fateful words Wyatt could never resist. Wanna bet? Instantly, Wyatt's blood began thrumming. What's the wager? Simple. I name a woman, I'll even give you her number, and you call her up right now. With me in the room. If she accepts your offer of a date, you win. If she laughs at you, I win. What are the stakes? Wyatt knew this was important. Jax grinned. Well, if you win, you get a date with a good-looking lady. But if I win, I get bragging rights that you're not as much of a Romeo as you like to think. Romeo was a kid who took poison, because he was too dumb to check for his sleeping girlfriend's pulse. His friend's chuckles returned. Fine. Then I get proof you're not as much of a Don Juan, better, and I also get the bragging rights that you finally, lost a bet to me. Well, that wasn't going to happen. As always, when there was a wager on the line, something kick-started in Wyatt's brain as he considered all the angles. From the time he was a little kid, he'd been lucky. No, more than lucky. There was a kind of sixth sense he had when it came to making and taking wagers. Something inside him just tugged him toward the right answer, toward the option which would let him win. Whether that be something like a racehorse's skill, which could be researched ahead of time, or a random coin flip, whatever it was, in the moment the bet was made, Wyatt instantly knew what the outcome would be. And in this moment, he could feel that sixth sense tugging him toward the correct answer. "You're on," he said, reaching down to place the can on the floor beside his recliner in order to have both hands free. Jax's brows twitched up. "Don't you even want to know who the lady is, before you accept?" Wyatt wrapped himself in arrogance and curled his lip at his friend. "I don't have to." Jax's grin grew. "Excellent. Okay, so I'll give you her number, you call her and ask her out on a date. Her answer determines the winner of the wager, right?" "Right." Wyatt shifted so he could pull his phone from his back pocket. "Whenever you're ready." He felt his heart beating faster than normal, the thrill of the wager already making him antsy. This was right. He could feel it, just like he could feel it every time he took a bet. He would win this wager. Jax had his phone out and was grinning as he read out a series of numbers with a local area code. For the first time, Wyatt hesitated. She's a local? The people of Caudron Valley had a stupid superstition about triplets, thinking they brought bad luck. It made it very difficult to date any of the single ladies, since whenever Wyatt passed, they were always doing that ridiculous thing where they licked their fingers and stuck them in the air to ward off bad luck. But Jax was shaking his head. She's from Black Aces. Ah, that was all right then. Jax and his family had an ancestral ranch over in Idaho somewhere, but their dad had married a woman from the nearby town of Black Aces, which had been founded on gambling. Now that Wyatt thought about it, and was how he and Jax had met each other, their high schools had been football rivals, and they'd slammed into each other more than once in their 4-year career. Then they'd discovered they'd been paired up on the college team for the defensive line, and the rest was history. So yeah, a date from Black Aces was far preferable to a local. "Are you going to tell me her name?" Jax grinned. "Not until you hit the dial button. I don't want to give you an unfair advantage to practice your smooth lines ahead of time." He was really playing up this wager, huh? Wyatt shook his head as he stared down at his phone, then he took a deep breath and pressed the big green button. As he lifted the phone to his ear and heard ringing on the line, he met his best friend's eyes and lifted a brow in question. Jax's grin grew. "You're calling my little sister, Artemis." Wyatt's eyes widened, his stomach flipped over, and his heart clenched. Oh, hell. Chapter 2. When Artie's phone rang, she was juggling 2 kids. Not kids, like human children, but baby goats, and she wasn't actually juggling them, but one was determined to climb up her chest and suck on her chin, while his brother was intent on chewing the sleeve of her shirt. "I can't believe I let you talk me into this," she muttered to her sister, Arya, short for Ariadne, as she tried to shuffle over to the counter where she'd left her phone. An unfamiliar number, but a local area code. Maybe it was Old Man Perkins, calling to let her know his mare had finally gone into labor? She'd given him her direct line, so he wouldn't have to worry about bothering the staff at the clinic. If this was him, she had to take it. "Oh, don't pretend like you're not excited to see them in cute little feetsy pajamas," Arya was saying, but Artie couldn't focus. "Here," she said to her sister, holding out one of the kids. "If this is a mare going into labor, we're going to have to curtail our evening of goat-related activities." "That would be a shame," Arya said with a straight face, as she took the animal. Artie tucked the other one under her arm like a football and reached for the phone. She was a little out of breath by the time she pressed the talk button and got it up to her ear. "Hello?" On the other end of the line, there was a sort of choking noise. "Hello? Mr. Perkins?" She shifted her hold on the baby goat and tried to calm her excitement. She'd had a feeling the mare would go into labor soon and had already loaded up all her equipment in the van. Of course, she had everything in her van. "Mr. Perkins?" she tried again. On the other end, a man cleared his throat. "Artie?" he asked, his voice sounding strained. "Hi, yeah, is everything okay?" She was beginning to wonder if it was Mr. Perkins on the other end of the line. "Is it your mare? Is she in labor?" Moonbeam?" "I don't think so." "Moonbeam." Artie squinted, then glanced down at the kid in the crook of her arm, who blinked up at her. Moonbeam wasn't the name of Mr. Perkins' mare. But it was the name of the prized racing horse at Cauldron Valley Ranch, who was pregnant with twins. Artie knew that, because after her best friend Bobby had married into the Cauldron family, she'd sweet-talked her way into a tour of the stables. And if this caller was mentioning Moonbeam. "Who is this?" she demanded. The man blew out a breath. "Boy, this got started off on the wrong foot, huh?" he muttered. In the background, it sounded as if another man laughed, but was quickly cut off. Her caller spoke up. "Artie, this is Wyatt Cauldron." "Hi." "Hi," she repeated dumbly. Her eyes grew wide, and her heart suddenly began beating a lot faster than was healthy. Hi. How are you?" "Hi," he said again. "I'm fine. How are you?" "Hi," she whispered, then lapsed into shocked silence. Wyatt Cauldron was calling her. Oh my god, oh my god, oh my god. In her excitement, she apparently squeezed the kid a little too tightly, because he let out an indignant bleat. "Artie?" Wyatt prompted. "Are you okay? You sounded." Bursting into motion, she whirled and shoved the kid into her sister's free arm. Arya was smirking at her, probably because she'd never seen Artie so flustered. Well, that's because Wyatt Gorgeousness Cauldron had never called her before. "I'm fine," she blurted, much too loudly. That was a goat." "A goat," Wyatt repeated flatly. "You've got a pet goat I don't know about? There's a lot of things you don't know about me." She tried to sound smooth and relaxed, but when she propped her hand against the exam table, she misjudged and stumbled a bit. Ariadne was giggling when she placed one of the goats on the floor and picked up a set of the soft yellow-footed PJs she'd knitted specifically for this photo shoot. And maybe Wyatt had somehow sensed Artie's artless fumble, because she could practically hear the smirk in his voice, when he said, "Artemis, I've known you since you were in school. Name one thing I don't know about you." O.M.G. She swallowed. I've had a crush on you since the day I met you. I think you're the hottest man in Montana. I would do anything to be with you, but I know you're too honorable to date your best friend's little sister. I'm always asking Jax about you, trying to find out what you like and don't like and everything in between. I'm borderline obsessed with you. And you don't even know I exist." But of course, she couldn't say any of that. I think baby goats in pajamas are cute," she blurted, then winced. "Well then," he drawled, "that's something we have in common. I've seen plenty of those videos online where the little goats are jumping all over the place. Do you actually have one right now?" Okay, she could do this." Forcing herself to breathe normally, she turned her back on Arya and her goat wrestling match, and reminded herself to just be cool for goodness sake. "My sister, Ariadne, has reserved a booth for the summer fair your church puts on. She had this idea to let cute baby goats model some of her wares as promo. Yeah, she could talk about animals and the clinic all day. See? This was easy. The clinic, happened to have a set of twin kids, so she showed up with the jammies, and I told her we could do a proof-of-concept shoot tonight. That sounds really adorable. How's it going?" He was smiling, she just knew it. And boy howdy, she could just imagine that smile. Wyatt Cauldron had the world's best smile, as far as she was concerned. He might be one of the notorious Cauldron triplets, and he might in fact look a lot like one of his cousins, but when he smiled, she'd never seen a more handsome man. She forced her mind back on his questions. "It's going." She twisted to see her sister, flat on her back, one goat standing on her belly, while she held the other one by the back legs, and glared. "It's going really well." When Arya switched her glare to Artie, Artie smiled broadly and held up one thumb, mouthing, "Great job." Arya rolled her eyes. Whirling away, Artie gave her back to her sister, determined to let her flounder with the animals alone while Artie talked to Wyatt Gorgeousness Cauldron. Who had called her? Squee. "Well, I can't wait to see the pics, whatever you come up with," he rumbled, in that sexy voice of his. Then he cleared his throat. "So, hey, I know I haven't been too smooth, but you're probably wondering why I called. Trying for her own brand of smooth, Artie said, it wasn't to talk about my goats? Behind her, Arya snorted. But Wyatt, bless him, chuckled. No. I mean, yeah, sure, I'd love to hear more about them. They're not really yours though, right? They're the clinic's? The Black Aces Animal Clinic was located on a big stretch of land outside of town. Which was good, because that's where Artie had always kept all the animals she couldn't find permanent homes for. She herself lived in a camper van, but the only animal who'd ever lived with her had been her old hound dog, Cerberus, who'd passed away last year. Their mama was having a little trouble feeding them, so the owner brought all 3 of them to me, she explained. I got mama's milk all figured out, and the owner is due to pick them back up the day after tomorrow. Gotcha. So you'd better get your photos taken sooner, rather than later, huh? I'm sorry I called and bothered you. I'm not. But she swallowed. Listen, Wyatt, I know you didn't call to chat about my goats. Behind her, Arya muttered something unsavory, and then there was the sound of something falling, but Artie didn't turn. You're right. On the other end of the line, she heard Wyatt take a deep breath. Although, you know, I like hearing about your day, and what you're up to and everything, Anne. Just ask her, came a muffled yell from someone in the background on Wyatt's end. The voice sounded familiar, but was muted enough she couldn't place it. Fine. Wyatt blew out that same breath. Artie, if you're not doing anything this weekend, would you like to go out with me? The sudden pounding in Artie's ears made her wonder, for a crazy moment, if she'd somehow gotten slammed with a wall of water, or submerged in a bathtub or something. Is that why she couldn't hear anything? Is that why she couldn't breathe? One hand pressed the phone against her ear, desperate to hold on to Wyatt, as her other hand groped for the back of the veterinarian's chair. She sank down into it just as her knees gave way. Breathe, girl, breathe. Oh. Oh, that may explain why everything was so fuzzy. She sucked in a sudden, desperate breath, just as he called her name again. Artie? What did you say? She blurted, her voice abnormally high-pitched. I asked you out. This weekend. We could, he swallowed. I dunno. Dinner, maybe? A date? A date with Wyatt Cauldron? You want to take me out? Dinner? This weekend, she repeated, knowing she must sound like a parrot. A date? Yes. You, Wyatt Cauldron, football star, suave gambler, hottie extraordinaire, want to take me, Artie Weston, solitary van dweller, animal-obsessed vet tech, on a date? He paused. If it's okay with you. Yes, she exclaimed. Yes, of course it's okay with me. On the other end of the line, she heard him blow out a breath. Had he been holding his breath, waiting for her answer? Cool. I mean, that's awesome, thanks. So, Saturday? Feeling giddy, she spun around in her chair. Yes. Where? I'll come pick you up. I live in a van. Or, why don't I meet you? Wherever. You sure? He sounded skeptical. Very sure. Well, okay then. How about we do dinner in Black Aces? Saturday. She was already nodding. I'll meet you in Old Town. There's a parking lot at the corner of Bluff Street and Blind Avenue. Sounds good. 5:30? She was certain her smile stretched ear to ear. It's a date. Yeah, he repeated softly, it's a date. He hung up first, and Artie waited for the beep signaling the call was disconnected, before she very calmly and carefully pressed her finger against the call button. Then she very calmly and carefully placed the phone on the counter and very calmly and carefully stood up, making sure to breathe deeply. And then she met her sister's eyes and saw Arya's raised brow. With a squeal, Artie's emotions broke free, and she began to jump up and down. Wyatt Cauldron asked me out. I know, Arya called from her place on the floor. The entire town knows now. These goats know. Laughing, Artie threw herself down on the floor beside her sister and reached for the kid who had already been wrestled into the yellow jammies. She burrowed her face in the wiry fur at the animal's neck and breathed deeply. The goat, in perfect timing, bleated adorably. He asked me out, Arya, she repeated, her voice muffled against the fur. And you said yes. Her sister sat up, reaching for the other set of pajamas. And I know you've said yes to plenty of other guys over the years. Her heart still pounding happily, Artie looked up with a big smile. Ariadne met her eyes, her smile equally big. But none of them were Wyatt Cauldron, huh? No, Artie sighed. Not even close. You've liked this guy for, like, ever. Artie nodded. Yeah. And Jax always refused to set us up. He said his little sisters were too good for any of his friends, remember? I remember he had a really hot friend, who played quarterback my freshman year, remember? Gah, I wanted to date him so bad, but Jax refused to introduce us, and then the guy moved away. That seemed like forever ago now, but Artie nodded. I've been irritated at Jax, and Pole, a few times over the years. Ari blew out a breath, which sounded like a chuckle, as she crooked her finger at the remaining kid, who was hiding under the table. Or was he chewing on a cable? Our brothers might be frustrating and overbearing and annoying, but you have to admit they love us. The Montana branch of the Weston family was big enough, it was no wonder some of their teachers had lost count of them all, but they'd all stuck together, through thick and thin, and have continued to watch out for one another. And every single one of the sisters had gotten angry at the oldest, Jax, over the years, for his refusal to set them up with his friends. But Wyatt was different. Artie had taken one look at him when she'd been in middle school, and he'd been in high school, and had fallen hard. She'd known he was the man she'd one day marry, and now. Whoa there, Missy. Don't get ahead of things. It's just a date. Just a date, she whispered. Yeah, but, Arya winked, a date is more than anything you've had before. You've liked this guy for, what? 15 years, and now you have a date with him. When Artie nodded, dazed, Arya nodded as well, then ordered, so don't screw it up. Artie burst into chuckles, relieved to have some way to release all this coiled energy, as her sister threw herself toward the remaining goat. As Ariadne wrestled the tiny kid, Artie carefully placed hers on the ground, giving it a soft pat on its pajama bottom. Yeah, she did have a date. A chance, maybe, to prove to Wyatt Cauldron she wasn't still the little girl he likely remembered. A part of her wondered if that's what he'd thought of her all these years, but if that's the case, then why would he have called and asked her out on a date in the first place? What did it matter? She was going to finally, go on a date with the man of her dreams. A crash interrupted her euphoria, as the chair she'd been sitting in earlier toppled, thanks to Aria's butt slamming into it. Oof, her sister cried, then lunged toward the goat once more. The poor little creature shot out from Aria's arms and straight into Artie's. Artie caught and cuddled the sweet kid, then lifted her chin imperiously at her sister. If you're done rolling around on the floor, Ariadne, perhaps you could come help me with this pet project of yours? Blowing out a frustrated breath, Arya began to chuckle as she reached for the other set of pajamas. Together, the two of them wrestled the baby goat into the clothes. The photo shoot was hilarious, and adorable, and a lot of fun, but nothing, not even the cute baby goats in pajamas, could compare to the anticipation in Artie's heart. I have a date with Wyatt. Chapter 3. When Wyatt saw her, his mouth went dry. Which was awkward as hell, all things considered. Even more awkward was when she saw him, and her whole face just lit right up. She waved happily, looked both ways, then darted across the main street. There was a moment, right before she reached him, when Wyatt really thought she was going to throw herself in his arms or something, and the really awkward thing was he was pretty dang sure he would just sweep her up in his arms and spin her around like one of those rom-com movies. Which, of course, he didn't watch. Ever. At all. He jammed his hands deep inside the pockets of his jeans to keep from reaching for her. As she skidded to a stop in front of him, her smile didn't dim as she looked him up and down. Hello, Wyatt. You look fantastic tonight. The compliment startled him, and he caught himself flushing. He had spent some time debating what to wear, something he normally didn't worry about, and had settled on a shirt which he thought complimented his green eyes. But it was a little embarrassing to hear her acknowledge his extra efforts. So he cleared his throat and forced himself to relax, and he also reminded himself to think of this as just any old regular date. "I'm supposed to say that to you. You look beautiful." He offered her a charming smile and his arm, which she latched onto. Did she feel the same warmth spreading through her body as he did, emanating from the point where they touched? He'd always known the two of them had a spark between them. "I bet you say that to all the girls," she teased him, as they began to walk down the street. Her tone was light, but her words. For some reason, Wyatt needed her to know she wasn't like other girls. Any other girl. "Artie," he murmured, staring down at her, "you are beautiful tonight." "You're beautiful all the time, but tonight." She was blushing when she glanced down at the little red sundress she was wearing and blue sweater thrown around her shoulders. Like all the Westons, she had pale blue eyes, and she kept her blonde hair cut short. Jax had once said it was so she didn't have to worry about pulling it back when she worked with the animals, but Wyatt also knew she was living in a camper van, and the bathrooms in those things were pretty tiny, so this was probably just the easiest hairstyle all around. The point is, she was beautiful. When had they stopped walking? When she glanced up at him, her ice blue eyes were wide, and her cheeks were bright pink. "Tonight," she whispered, prompting him to finish what he'd been saying. "Tonight you're mine, on my arm," he finished politely instead, then smiled. "And that means a lot to me." Her lips formed the shape of a little O, and his smile grew as he tugged her into motion once more. They were headed for one of the oldest restaurants in town, and when he asked her what she knew about the place, in an attempt to put her at ease, Artie had soon shaken off her blush and was giving him a history of the town. "Black Aces has been around since the big gold rushes, of course. It was actually my mom's ancestor, Jim Hoyle, who founded the bicycle mine outside of town." She pointed. "He lost the deed under mysterious circumstances, and the town went through a nasty period, where the new owner, Augustus King, really bled the place dry. We were in danger of becoming a ghost town, when suddenly, Hoyle's son returned, again, mysterious circumstances, and with the help of the woman who would become his wife, kicked King's butt." Wyatt was chuckling as he held the restaurant's door open. "You sound proud of that." "Trust me, King was a nasty piece of work. The son, Jack Hoyle, was some kind of pirate/acrobat/prince or something, according to family folklore. His wife was one of the first female Pinkertons, if you can believe it." When he held out a chair for her, she smiled up at him. "Our family stories are really cool." As he slid into the chair across from her, he noticed all the other tables were more than 6 feet apart. That would give them plenty of privacy, he was certain. "I can't believe Jax has never once mentioned this to me. I've been to your ranch, is that where the mine used to be?" Nodding her head, she propped her elbows up on the table. "The mine actually turned a small profit again when they found copper, but ultimately, they turned part of the land over to cattle. Part of the house we grew up in was the original home Jim Hoyle had built in the 1800s, but we had to add on a lot." Chuckling, Wyatt reached for his menu. "You do have a lot of siblings. Jax is the oldest, right? I've lost count of how many more you have." Instead of listing them, she just smiled down at her menu. "Me too at times," she muttered, with a quiet laugh. When the server came to take their order, he gave them a brief history of the restaurant. Wyatt was surprised to learn the establishment had been in place since the town's beginnings. "Hey, maybe your ancestors ate here," he said to Artie, when the older man had paused to take a breath. The server grinned behind his white beard and nodded to her. "They most certainly did, Miss Weston. Your mother's people, the Hoyles, had been frequenting this place for generations." The old man looked as if he'd been around long enough to know most of them, but Wyatt kept his mouth shut and just listened. At some point during the impromptu lesson, Artie uncrossed her legs. Under the table, her foot brushed against his leg, just above his boot. And she kept it there. Swallowing slightly, suddenly not listening to the old man at all, he shifted his foot forward, until his boot was pressed against the side of her little ballet-slippered foot. He watched her catch her breath as their eyes slammed into one another. Then she blushed again, and her eyes dropped to the menu, but she still didn't move her foot. He found himself smiling as he ordered a big, juicy burger, a large order of onion rings, and a medium chocolate shake. He smiled when he heard her say, "I'll have what he's having, but make mine a medium order of rings and a strawberry shake," and after the server left, she returned the smile. "I didn't expect to learn quite so much history on this date," he began, and was surprised when her smile fell. "I mean, I like it," he scrambled to assure her. "It's really interesting. But Jax never talks about this stuff." She peeked up at him, then offered a little shrug. "I don't think he's as interested in the Black Aces side of the family as I am. He's a Weston, through and through." Nodding, Wyatt reached for his chocolate shake the server had just delivered. "A few times he's mentioned going out to Idaho, to your family's ranch out there, but I honestly didn't realize you had family here in Montana as well." She took a sip of her strawberry shake, and he didn't think he'd soon forget the sight of her lips wrapped around that straw, pulling hard to get the pink ice cream through the small opening. It was really cute, and pretty dang sexy, the way her lips pursed, and her cheeks sucked in. Under the table, his blue jeans tightened in response. "This is Jax's little sister. Cool it. Even if the whole thing was his idea, he clearly doesn't want you to date Artie in any serious way, otherwise he wouldn't have bet against you. Yeah, best to remember that. No matter how good she looked in that sexy little sundress, good enough to eat, or how badly he wanted to taste her, she was still his best friend's little sister." Throughout the years, Jax had made it perfectly clear Wyatt wasn't good enough for Artie Weston, or any of his other sisters either. Dimly, Wyatt realized Artie was telling him about the Idaho branch of the family. He took another sip of the chocolate shake, to try to calm his libido, and forced himself to listen. Big property out there, which they turned into a sort of tourist destination, called Rivers End Ranch. People come from all over to visit. They have riding, hiking, boating, swimming, skiing, snowmobiling, and, oh man, their Christmas celebrations are just incredible. She sighed happily as she poked her spoon into her shake. "I used to love going out there for Christmas when we were little." It sounded pretty cool to him. "Why don't you go anymore?" She shrugged. "I've been out a few times since I became an adult, and I know a few of my siblings have done the same. But I think Mom and Dad just reached a point where there were too many of us to travel with." Wyatt hadn't been exaggerating, he couldn't keep up with all the Weston kids. "I can imagine it'd get overwhelming. I can't imagine feeding all of you." Chuckling, she nodded. Mom got to the point where everything was just buffet style. She'd make a big pot of something, and whoever was there to eat on time, got to have dinner. Everyone else, my brother, Paul, was always late, had to scrounge for themselves. Wyatt was laughing by this point, imagining the chaos. "And I'll bet it didn't help you're all named after Greek gods. What were your parents thinking?" "Thinking?" She slapped her hand against her chest, as if offended. "They were thinking? And don't a bunch of you have names which start with the letter A?" She dropped her head into her hands. "Ugh, don't remind me. What kind of crazy parents do that? As if it wasn't hard enough keeping us straight, with all the sets of twins, they go and give us identical names." "Wait, not identical. You're Artemis, and I know your twin is Apollo, right?" "Of course." She lifted her head to roll her eyes. "How could you not name your first twins Artemis and Apollo, right? We're not all Greek gods. Ajax the Great was a Greek hero, not a god." Wyatt's surprised bark of laughter interrupted her. "I always forget that's his real name. Ajax. What a horrible name." She nodded seriously. "Which is why, when someone uses it, he always insists on adding the great to the end." Wyatt was laughing so hard now, the other diners were turning to stare. "I'm not," he gasped, shaking his head. "I'm not calling him that." She was giggling too, but muffling it with her napkin, which he thought was just adorable. "I know. That's why all of us sane people just call him Jax." "Jax it is." Wyatt got control of himself. "What is up with your family names, Artie?" When he said her name, she sobered and smiled softly. Then she shrugged and reached for her spoon. As she spoke, she again poked at her shake. Mom was a classics major and wrote her thesis on Ajax the Great, so I think Dad went along with it for the first few kids. But in Dad's family, a lot of the men are named W names. He's Wayland Weston, and his brothers are Wilbur, Wilfred, and Winston. The branch that runs the ranch are all WS too, one of them is a Wyatt, in fact. You have an uncle named Winston Weston? Wait, your cousin is also a Wyatt? She nodded. He's nice. They're all nice, but I haven't seen them in a few years. I've heard they've all gotten married in the last few years and are having kids now. It seems weird to think none of my siblings have gotten married. Married. There was that word again. Pops wanted him to marry. Bob, Cade, Jim, Decker, and Ted had all gotten married in the last few months. Not only that, but they'd put money on a wager Wyatt would be married soon too. Wyatt had flat out refused. He'd known he wouldn't marry, because he couldn't. He couldn't marry, because the only woman he wanted to marry was off limits to him. His best friend had made that very clear years ago. But now. He swallowed. Now he was on a date with her. The woman he'd been thinking about for years. The only woman he could imagine spending forever with. But he'd taken a bet. That meant, in order to win, he couldn't marry Artie or anyone else. Luckily, their burgers arrived at that moment, and he was saved from having to make any major life decisions for the time being. Holy moly, this thing is huge, she declared. Then, to his surprise, she looked up at him and winked. As the actress said to the bishop. Well, he couldn't help it, when the sweet little thing in front of him basically just made a "that's what she said" joke, he burst out laughing once more. He couldn't recall the last time he'd laughed this much over dinner, but he sure as sugar was going to remember that line. As they dug in, they made small talk. He liked the way she ate with her elbows planted on the table and talked with her hands flying all about with enthusiasm. Grams probably would have said it wasn't polite, but Wyatt didn't care, he liked her enthusiasm for everything she did. Tell me about the clinic, he demanded, his burger halfway to his mouth. Are you sure? She reached for her napkin to wipe her fingers, then her mouth. I can talk about my work until the cows come home. He finished chewing and swallowed. That's okay. The only cows I see right now are on our plate. She wrinkled her nose and stared mournfully down at her plate. Poor Bessie. It's too bad nature made her so delicious. She really was a hoot, wasn't she? Chuckling, Wyatt shook his head. I can't believe you live in Montana and don't know that's more likely to be a Bert than a Bessie. But she just shrugged. I'm more involved in the beginning part of their lives than the end. You work with babies? Are you sure you want to get me started? He caught and held her gaze. I really am. I could listen to you talk all night. When her cheeks flamed bright pink, he realized how phenomenally stupid he'd sounded, stupid and sappy, and reached for his burger once more to cover his own flesh. Way to be suave, Casanova. It was a good thing Jax couldn't see him now. Wyatt would likely lose the bet, even if Artie was sitting across from him. In fact, it was a good thing Jax couldn't know Wyatt's thoughts at that moment, thoughts which were making his jeans so tight. A few awkward minutes passed as they ate, and then Artie peeked up at him from under her lashes. I always knew I wanted to be a vet tech. I'm not a doctor, just sort of. Well, I guess I'm considered the veterinarian's assistant. Grateful to have a new, not-so-awkward topic of conversation, Wyatt latched onto it. Do you like working at the clinic? She glanced to her left, then to her right, then leaned forward and lowered her voice, as if imparting a great secret. I don't love it. My boss, well, we don't always see eye to eye on things. That's why I started my little side business. I guess you could call it consultation work? She shrugged, then straightened. What is it you do exactly? Jax had told him a time or two, but Wyatt didn't get too many specific details from him. She smiled happily. I specialize in labor and birth for animals. Mostly farm animals, honestly, because this is Montana. Wait, you're an animal midwife? That's a thing? Shrugging, she reached for another onion ring. Most animals do it on their own. That's the point, really. But some have trouble, and that's when the ranchers or owners call me. I've also gotten really good at helping with nursing and latching issues, which means I get to cuddle with lots of newborn animals. She smiled. I don't have any formal training in any of this, not really, but I think I'm pretty good at my job. I think you're pretty good at a lot of things, Artie, he murmured. When she blushed again, he shook his head at his own awkwardness and asked her another question about the clinic. They spent the rest of the meal swapping funny stories about life on a ranch, and he found himself telling her all about Moonbeam, Caudron Valley's pregnant mare. As they stood to leave, she told him she'd met the mare already and had even chatted with Jim about her care. He asked my opinion on a few things and let me check her out. Wyatt's brows rose as they stepped out into the street. Jim doesn't trust just anyone around his horses, you know. He's the reason the Caudron Valley racetrack is such a success. To his surprise, she winced. Instinctively, he took her hand. What's wrong? With a sigh, she shook her head. I feel like I completely dominated the conversation tonight, Wyatt. I'm so sorry. I didn't ask you about the racetrack, or how the planning is going for the annual rodeo, or anything. Smiling, he gave her fingers a gentle squeeze, and was heartened when she squeezed back and peeked up at him. That's okay, he murmured, with what he knew was a goofy grin. I liked hearing all about you. Jax has told me plenty of stuff over the years, of course, but I haven't had the chance to talk to you. He watched her swallow, then take a deep breath. When she met his eyes, he couldn't look away. I'm really glad you called to ask me out, Wyatt, she whispered, and he was hit simultaneously with an equal share of both guilt and joy. Me too, he managed. But he also knew that, had Jax not made that wager, he would have gone the rest of his life watching Artie from afar, watch her find someone and settle down and start a family, while Wyatt slowly. He shook his head. You're being melodramatic. He wouldn't wither and die if Artie were married to someone else. But if that happened, it would mean that, without a doubt, Wyatt would be alone. But Jax's bet meant he was able to spend an evening with her. One night, which was quickly coming to an end. Panicking, he tugged her a little closer. You know, if you feel guilty about not hearing me talk about myself, there is a solution. We could go out again. If you wanted. He held his breath, torn between hope and fear, until she slowly smiled. You really mean that? Even though I talked about myself nonstop, and probably made a fool of myself with my table manners, and bored you with my family history? You want to go out with me again? He couldn't think of anything else he'd rather do. But all he managed to give her was a strangled yes in reply. I'd like that, a lot, Wyatt. I'm free most nights, or next weekend if you'd prefer. How about tomorrow? How about later tonight? He didn't want this date to end. But he also didn't want to come across as too desperate. Or creepy. He didn't want her to run to Jax and spill the beans about how eager Wyatt had been to see her again. Jax would probably make the argument Wyatt wasn't the Don Juan he claimed to be. He wasn't, but Jax didn't need to know that, and would insist he won the bet. So Wyatt managed to keep his voice calm when he offered, how about next weekend? A movie? I'd like that. She was smiling when, to Wyatt's surprise, she pushed herself up on her tiptoes and brushed a kiss across his cheek. Thank you for a wonderful evening, she said, as she lowered herself back down. Then she squeezed his hand once more, before pulling away. As she backed away from him, she lifted her fingers in a little perky wave, still smiling broadly. Bye, Wyatt. And all he could do was raise his hand in an answering wave, as she turned and skipped down the street. Bye, Artemis. Best date ever. Chapter 4. Longest week ever. The fact Mr. Perkins' mare went into labor couldn't even distract Artie. She was elbows deep up a horse's bottom and could still think about Wyatt, but perhaps she shouldn't mention that to him. Of course, if she did, he'd probably tease her for thinking foals came out the mare's bottom, but she had standards and didn't intend on mentioning lady bits to him before they were married and… Oh my God! Where had that thought come from? It was likely the picture of a wild rose he'd texted to her Monday, after their date in Black Aces. It had come accompanied with a smiley face, and a note, saying, "Thought you'd like to see what I found growing behind the track outbuildings this morning." She'd replied, "Don't cut it down until I have a chance to see it." His reply of, "I won't touch it," came back so quickly, she knew he'd been staring at his phone the same way she had. They'd texted each other many times throughout the week, just little notes, nothing life-altering or super meaningful, but it was nice. He made her smile, and not just when he teased her, or called her goddess the way he had on Tuesday's text. On Wednesday, she'd received 4 random snapshots he'd taken around the racetrack, another picture of wildflowers, 2 separate shots of horses practicing, and one of a bunch of ledgers open on a table, accompanied by the text, "I hate spreadsheets." At first, she wasn't sure what to make of them, but then she realized they didn't mean anything. They were just Wyatt's way of showing her he was thinking of her. And that realization made her all sorts of flustered and flattered. Her stomach still flip-flopped at the thought of him, only now, the darn thing was doing it each time her phone dinged, and Ariadne had teased her for how fast she scrambled to pick it up. When she sent him a shot of 2 baby kittens she saw on Thursday, he replied with a heart emoji, and her own heart fluttered a bit. A bit? No, a lot. As a medical professional, a heart flutter is nothing to sneeze at. She rolled her eyes at herself. She wasn't sneezing at Wyatt, good heavens, no. But she was dreaming of him, not the girlish dreams she used to have of marrying him and living happily ever after. Well, those were still there, but now her dreams were decidedly more adult. She kept imagining what his hands would feel like on her skin. Surely she hadn't imagined the spark which had passed between them when he'd touched her at the restaurant. And she couldn't stop wondering how he would taste when she finally kissed him. Because she was going to kiss him. She'd waited 15 years for the chance, and he'd been the one to ask for a second date. That meant he didn't hate her, so she was determined to find out just how Wyatt Cauldron tasted. "You seem awfully distracted, sis," Jax teased her, when they joined Mom and Dad for dinner Friday evening. "Anything new in your life?" There was no way he could know about her dating his best friend and not put a stop to it. Especially after all the years he'd forbidden it. But he was still sitting there smirking at her, as if he knew something she didn't, so she just stuck her tongue out at him and ignored his chuckle in return. And then it was finally Saturday, and she was off work and waiting impatiently for her movie date with Wyatt. She slept in that morning and indulged in a long, hot shower that afternoon. As she ran the rose-scented soap over her shoulders, she wondered again what it would feel like to have him touch her there, or everywhere. Heck, having him touch her anywhere at this point would be great. What will he taste like? She was still daydreaming of kissing Wyatt Cauldron when she stepped out of the shower. Her bed was only an arm's reach from the tiny bathroom, and saw he'd texted, naked except for a towel wrapped around her. She flopped down on the bed and snatched up the phone. "Still up for a movie tonight?" Her fingers flew across the keyboard. "You bet. Where should we meet? How about you come to the ranch? I'll meet you at the main parking. Is 4:30 too early?" She was smiling when she sent him a thumbs up and wrote, "See you there. Can't wait." And when he replied, "Me too," she squealed and fell over backward, kicking her feet happily in the air. That afternoon, she pulled up to the main parking area for Caudron Valley Ranch. It was away from the main house and the other houses, even the racetrack, but it was where most of the hands who didn't live on the ranch parked when they came to work. She parked her van away from the crowd and climbed out just in time to see Wyatt's Jeep bumping over the gravel road from the direction of the track. He parked next to her and jumped out. For a moment, she thought he might reach for her and pull her into a hug. She was already leaning toward him, when he seemed to decide against it, and instead, pulled his hat from his head and ran his hand sheepishly through his hair. "Hi, Artie," he said, in that adorable trying-to-be suave way of his. "Hey." Her voice came out in a higher pitch than usual. "Is it okay that I parked here?" She jerked a thumb over her shoulder. Totally. That's your home? He took a few steps toward the van, then stopped. Sorry, don't mean to pry. Waving him forward, she pulled open the big door on the side. No problem. It's messy, but it's mine. The bed's back there. It converts to bench seats, but I leave it as a bed full time. The kitchen's small, but mostly I just microwave dinners and drink coffee, so it works for me. I left the passenger seat in, but mostly just use it as storage. He pointed to the dog bed she hadn't had the heart to get rid of. And your roommate? That belonged to Cerberus. I had to put him down over the winter, and I just haven't. Hey, it's okay. I get it, he said sincerely. When he touched her arm, she felt those same tingles again. Nodding, she smiled. He was old and couldn't get around easily, and I'm just thankful he isn't lingering on and suffering. I plug in at the campground at Black Aces most months, but last winter, I spent more time at my parents' home so he could rest comfortably in front of a warm fire. She sighed. I'm sorry for bringing it up. Artie cleared her throat and forced a smile. It was his time, circle of life, and all that. I miss him, and I'll get another pup someday, but for now, I've got my work animals to cuddle. Well, how about our date? Oh yeah, I've been thinking about this date all week. She wasn't sure what had possessed her to admit that little tidbit, since it made her sound desperate, but when his green eyes lit up, she was glad she had. Are you okay with snackies for dinner? I know you said you microwaved your meals. She held up a finger. Okay. 1, I said that, because it's all I know how to make. She held up a second finger. 2, snackies for dinner is, like, one of my 3 favorite things in the world. A third finger. And 3, any man who uses the term snackies is absolutely not getting out of feeding me dinner. He looked caught between blushing and smiling, and she decided she could look at Wyatt Cauldron all day long. I can cook real food too, he hurried to point out, although my lasagna's not nearly as good as Griselda's, but I thought it would be fun to fill up on snackies, and why in the heck do I keep saying the word snackies? He winced and shook his head. Still blushing, he was actually blushing, and wasn't that adorable? He jerked his head toward his Jeep. After Artie shut her camper van up and locked it, she accepted Wyatt's invitation and followed him. So. He cleared his throat and held open the Jeep's door for her. What are the other 2? It was clear he was trying to change the subject, so she went along with it. Other 2 what? There was no roof on the vehicle, so she could hear him even after he slammed the door and walked around to the other side. You said snacks for dinner was one of your 3 favorite things. What are the other 2? Oh. Well, she couldn't exactly tell him the truth, could she? Her 3 favorite things, in descending order, were 3, snackies for dinner. 2, really naughty romance novels. 1, the memory of the time she caught a peek of Wyatt Cauldron without a shirt on. She was probably blushing herself now as she lied to him. My other 2 favorite things? Puppy kisses and guacamole. He was smiling when he climbed in beside her. Excellent. We're going to have fun tonight, I can tell. Gasping in mock surprise, she clapped her hands. Puppies? Laughing, he shook his head and pulled out of the parking area. We're going to the drive-in. This time her gasp wasn't mocking, she really was thrilled. I haven't been to a drive-in in years. Yeah, the old drive-in is doing big business these days, since the theater in town is temporarily shut down because of that freak infection everyone got from licking their fingers. As they pulled onto the highway, she started to reply, but the sound of the wind was too loud. So she just sat back in her chair and watched him from the corner of her eye. He was so relaxed and happy with the wind blowing through his dark hair. He'd tucked the brim of his hat up under his thigh to keep it in place, and she thought how perfect he looked in his element. When he's with me, he looks happy. That was important for some reason, and as soon as she could make her heart and mind calm down enough, she'd think about that. Probably. Maybe. When they reached the drive-in, they were an hour early for the movie, but they weren't the only couple there. Several others were spread out around the parking lot, some sitting together on blankets spread out on the ground, while others sat on the tailgate of their trucks, or sat in their vehicles, taking advantage of the illusion of privacy, as they shared food and enjoyed their time together. The thought of her and Wyatt as a couple had Artie's heart speeding up again. Probably not healthy. Wyatt climbed out and began digging around in the back of his Jeep. He soon returned carrying a small tray with legs, which he placed between them where the console would usually be on other vehicles. He also had a couple bags dangling from one hand, one a refrigerated bag, but put those on his lap so she couldn't see what was inside. From one bag, he pulled out tortilla chips, a bag filled with pieces of pita bread, and a container each of baby carrots and cucumber slices. When she reached for a carrot, he slapped her hand playfully and waggled his finger. "Wait for the good stuff." She eyed the spread. "It gets better?" "These are just the dippers." With a flourish, Wyatt reached into the bag once more and pulled out a thermos. He then unscrewed the top of the thermos to reveal hot queso dip, and from the refrigerated bag, he pulled out hummus and, be still my heart, guacamole. With wide eyes, she took in the obviously homemade treats. "Did you get Griselda to make all this for us?" "No," he sounded almost proud as he reached back into the second bag and handed her a cold can of soda. "I made it all." She reached for a chip and plunked it into the guac. When she took a bite, she didn't even bother hiding her moan. "I'm in love." "You made this?" He was blushing again. She decided she loved to make him blush. He went from being sexy to being, well, cute. As they ate, he told her his recipe and urged her to try making it herself. "Why would I do that?" she teased, waggling a carrot at him. "Then I wouldn't have an excuse to visit you and get you to make it for me." "Very true." He smiled and dipped a chip in the queso. "Did I tell you there's homemade brownies for dessert?" With another moan, she fell back against the seat. "I'm in heaven, Wyatt. Absolute heaven. What movie are we watching?" He nodded toward the big screen where some workers were checking on things before the show. "Tonight, they're showing The Princess Bride." "Really?" That was an unusual movie for a big strong cowboy to want to watch, wasn't it? Maybe there'd only been the one option, so Wyatt had simply gone with it. "It's been a few years since I've seen it," she confessed. "When I was a little girl, Jax and Pole used to tease me, because I was so afraid of the scene with the Rouses." Instead of asking her what she meant, Wyatt shook his head. "Rodents of unusual size? I don't believe they exist." She gasped. That had been word for word a line from the movie. "You know The Princess Bride? Why does that sound so inconceivable?" Another line. She stifled her giggles and tried for a serious mien as she shook her head. "I do not think that means what you think that means." He pointed a pita chip at her nose. "That was a pretty good act." Then he grinned. "And that's a fact. There was a character in the movie who was always rhyming, and another who hated it." So, outright chuckling now, Artie blurted the line, "No more rhyming." "I mean it." And right on cue, Wyatt finished, "Anybody want a peanut?" They were both laughing now, but she shook her head. "You really do like the movie?" He winked. "I've probably got it all memorized, I've seen it so many times. But don't tell anyone, it'll ruin my street cred." She couldn't contain her snort of laughter at the idea of him having street cred, but he continued. "How about you? Obviously you've seen The Princess Bride a few times yourself." "Yeah, but honestly, I'm more of a book gal." She crunched down on a carrot covered in hummus. "Oh my gosh. This is so good." "Thanks," he said with a smile. "So you prefer books to movies?" She shrugged. "I guess so. I left most of my paperbacks in the library at my parents' house, but with my Kindle, I can keep 1,000 books in my van, easy peasy." Instead of teasing her, like her brothers might have, or dismissing her love of reading, Wyatt was nodding. "Well, if you've got space, remind me to loan you my hardback copy of The Princess Bride. I think William Goldman crafts a brilliant story, and the foreword to the book is just incredible." The man had a hard copy of The Princess Bride? And he'd read it enough to have opinions on it? be still my heart. It took a moment to realize he was staring at her, his brows dipped in as if he were concerned. Artie? Why are you staring at me like that? You don't have to take the book if you don't want to. But she shook her head. Had she been staring? Oh. Well, could anyone really blame her? She shook her head again, and realized she was leaning toward him over the picnic. Wow. What? He murmured. Was it her imagination, or was he also leaning toward her? How to explain? I've spent the last 15 years watching you, Wyatt. I mean, flustered, she straightened. That sounded creepy, sorry. I just meant I've known you a long time. He was nodding, a little hesitantly. Yeah. Same here. She shrugged, and, well, now that I'm getting to know you, the real you, not the you I hear about from my brother, or the you I see when you're with him or your family, where had she been going with that sentence before it had gotten away from her? Oh, yeah. Anyway, it turns out you're different from how I've always thought you were. She watched him swallow, then watched his tongue flick out over his bottom lip. His gaze dropped to the soda can he was holding. Different in a good way, he murmured, and she decided she very much preferred this hesitancy to the suave confidence she'd previously seen him throw around all their lives. There was something in the way he held his shoulders, something in his voice, which told her how important the question was, told her how much her answer mattered to him. So, even though he wasn't looking, she nodded. Then she reached across the picnic, the food he'd made for her from scratch, and took his hand. Yeah, Wyatt, she whispered. Definitely in a good way. And on the screen in front of them, the movie began to play. Chapter 5. The two of them threw movie quotations back and forth all the way back to the ranch. Wyatt couldn't remember when he'd ever laughed so hard, which was nice. No, she was nice. Being with Artie was nice. It was better than nice, it was perfect. Still chuckling, he hopped out of the Jeep and hurried around to hold the door open for Artie. The parking area was dark this far from the stables, but he didn't really notice. All he could think about was getting close to her again. When she slid from his Jeep, he didn't step out of the way, and she didn't seem to mind. Instead, she stood between him and the vehicle, and tilted her head back to smile up at him. The light from the moon reflected off her pale hair and light eyes, and he remembered Artemis had been the goddess associated with the moon. The way Artie glowed silver in the moonlight, he could believe it. You know, she whispered, swaying toward him, we both know that movie so well, we probably didn't have to go see it. His lips quirked as he placed his left hand on her right hip. She didn't seem to mind that either. Yeah, but I enjoyed sharing it with you. Me too. When she shifted closer, he dropped his right hand to her left hip. But it'd be a shame to let this evening end without a kiss. He heard the unspoken words as loudly as if she'd shouted them. But despite the way his brothers and cousins teased him about being a ladies' man, Grams had raised him to be a gentleman. He wasn't going to make assumptions. Artemis Weston, I'd like to kiss you now, he murmured, staring at her lips. Would you mind? Just as formally, she replied, Wyatt Cauldron, I think I shall go absolutely batty if you do not, post-haste. And then she pushed herself up on her toes and met his lips. It was everything he'd imagined, but so much more. Her arms rose to reach around his neck, and when she twisted her fingers through his hair, he shuddered and dragged his tongue across her lower lip. With a sexy little groan, she opened her lips under his touch, and he was thrilled when her tongue came out to play as well. Who knows how long they stood there, lips exploring one another, before he realized how close he was to losing control. With a gasp, he pulled away, dropping his forehead to hers and breathing heavily. However, she didn't seem to be done yet, and stretched to brush a kiss across his jaw, then the corner of his lips. With a groan, he pulled her closer and kissed her again. Artie tasted even better than he'd imagined. All those years of fantasies, completely fulfilled. Well, almost all. It was another long moment before they broke apart, and this time, she was breathing just as heavily as he was. She whispered a line from The Princess Bride, since the invention of the kiss, there have been 5 kisses that were rated the most passionate, the most pure. This one left them all behind. He released a breathy chuckle, then dropped another quick kiss to her lips. You don't know how long I've wanted to do that. What? Use that line? No, another softer kiss. Kiss you. He felt, more than heard, her little, oh. You don't know how long I've wanted to do that. It felt like forever, but probably only 10 years, since the day he'd come home and visited Black Aces, and realized his best friend's little sister had grown up when he hadn't been looking. Her arms were still around his neck, and she was again playing with the hair under his hat. So, if you've wanted to do that for a while. He hummed, urging her to continue. Maybe, when she peeked up at him, the moonlight caused her pale eyes to glow impishly. Maybe we should do it again. Good thinking, he murmured. She was smiling when their lips met once more. This time, they were interrupted by a set of headlights, which had them pulling apart and squinting. Lifting his hand to shadow his eyes, Wyatt watched the car pull into the parking area, then peel off toward the stables, where it came to a stop. Wyatt then heard a lot of doors slamming, and distantly, he heard several voices calling out to one another. Come to think of it, there were a lot more vehicles at the stables than what was normal for a Saturday night. Something's going on over there. Artie was peering around him at the commotion. Wyatt knew then that the date was officially over. Yeah, he muttered. Something was wrong. He could feel it, the same way he could feel which wager was a sure bet. Artie took his hand and began tugging at him. Come on. Let's go figure out what's going on. Just as curious as she was, the two of them hurried across the parking area to find the stables all lit up, and more than a few of the hands rushing about. Hey, Seth. Wyatt called out to the man jogging by. What's up? The good-natured hand, one of Jim's protégés, changed direction to meet up with them. He nodded politely to Artie. Good evening, ma'am. Then he shifted a worried gaze to Wyatt. Moonbeam's in labor. She's been at it since late this afternoon. We had a feeling she'd start early, but none of us thought it'd be this early. There was enough concern in the experienced man's expression to cause ice to form in Wyatt's stomach. Where's Jim? He croaked hoarsely. Seth nodded deeper into the stables. He's been with her the whole time. Doc Phillips is on his way now, your brothers and the rest of your cousins are waiting back there too. As the man hurried off in the direction he'd been heading before being interrupted, Wyatt began pulling Artie toward Moonbeam's stall. And thank goodness she didn't object, he needed her here tonight. For him, yes, but also for Moonbeam. How is she? He asked, as he hurried toward Decker and Ted, who were standing near one of the columns and peering anxiously into one of the bigger stalls. Both swung their attention to him long enough to nod in greeting, but it was Ted who answered, as they both glanced back at the bustle of excitement. We knew it would be a hard labor. I guess we just didn't know how hard. As soon as Wyatt moved up beside his brother and cousin, he could see Kate and Bob in the stall with Moonbeam, and Jim on his knees beside the animal, soothing the laboring animal with softly spoken words of encouragement as he rubbed her belly. The mare had been a champion racer and had won Wyatt more than a few wagers over the years. When Bob had started breeding her, they knew she'd birth champions too. But none of them had counted on her getting pregnant with twins. It was dangerous, and all 6 of them knew if things went wrong, it could mean disaster for the ranch. Moonbeam and those foals were the future of Caudron Valley Ranch, and Wyatt knew he wasn't the only one praying all 3 would make it through safely. Beside him, Artie pulled her hand from his. How are their heartbeats? She asked, her manner professional. Deck and Ted both started in surprise, then looked at one another and shrugged. Should we know that information? Deck asked. She rolled her eyes and blew out a dismissive breath. She just stepped toward the stall, when Jim stepped out of it, wiping his hands on a cloth. Any word from Doc Phillips yet, Artie? His expression went from worried to relieved so fast, Wyatt felt a twinge of jealousy. Thank goodness you're here. I could really use your advice and help. Artie nodded and pulled her purse from over her shoulder. Handing it to Wyatt, without even looking in his direction, she said to Jim, I'd be happy to consult. Let me go wash my hands. Then she hurried off, leaving Wyatt cradling her purse and feeling a little lost. Doc. Jim hurried around the men, his hand outstretched in greeting. "Thanks so much for coming." The local veterinarian was only a year younger than the two sets of Cauldron triplets, and, as Wyatt thought of him, was on his way to being a reformed finger-licker. Most of the population of the town thought triplets were unlucky, and would do this stupid thing where they licked their fingers and shoved them in the air whenever a cauldron walked by or was mentioned. Wyatt watched as Doc Phillips lifted his hand toward his mouth, then swallowed and stopped the motion halfway through. Instead, he took Jim's hand, with what appeared to Wyatt to be a forced smile. "Of course, Jim. I'm glad I'm able to help. What can you tell me?" Artie was on her way back, rolling up her sleeves, and Jim called her over. "Before we start, Doc, this is Artie Weston." "Artie, Doc Phillips." They nodded politely to one another, with Artie holding her hands up to show she'd just washed them. Artie works for the clinic over in Black Aces, and specializes in laboring animals. "We're lucky she's here tonight." Instead of asking why Artie was there that evening, the veterinarian and Jim headed into the stall, already speaking in low murmurs about Moonbeam. Artie shot a grin over her shoulder at Wyatt, then followed them inside. Silence followed, until Ted cleared his throat and crossed his arms. "So. Artie Weston, huh? Isn't that Jax's little sister?" "She's also Bobby's best friend," Deck offered. "CJ calls her Auntie Artie." Both of the other men had just married the women they loved. Deck's new wife came with a cute 6-year-old daughter, and Wyatt couldn't recall ever seeing his brother so happy. And he couldn't recall anything as awkward as standing up there at the altar between Deck and Ted, trying to keep his eyes off the pale goddess in the second row, sitting beside his best friend, as her best friend walked down the aisle. "Huh. I'm in love with my brother's wife's best friend, whose brother is my best friend. This is confusing." It took a moment, but finally, the words which had run through his mind almost made him stumble. "In love? No, that wasn't possible. Tonight was only their second date. Granted, it was a date he'd been hoping for a long time to one day have with her, but still, he wasn't in love with Artie. He couldn't be. "So, Artie Weston, huh?" Ted prompted. "Another one of your conquests, Wyatt?" Before Wyatt could do more than frown in irritation, Deck elbowed their cousin. "Nah, she's special. Look at the way he's staring after her." Ted hummed. "Does this mean we're about to win our bet?" Wyatt's brother widened his eyes with an innocence no one believed. "You mean the one where he bet us each $1,000 that he wouldn't be married by September?" "That one? Yep, that's the one I mean." "Is our always so certain he's right that he wagers good money on it? Wyatt actually going to lose a bet?" Deck cocked his head, glancing between Wyatt and Artie's backside, where she was bent over Moonbeam. Wyatt scowled at him, both for looking at her derriere, and for what he was hinting at. "I think that might just be the case, Ted." Wyatt felt his hand curl into a fist, and he tightened his hold on Artie's purse. "Would you two knuckleheads knock it off? Just because you guys all got married like it was some hip new thing, doesn't mean I'm going to do it." "Why not?" Ted asked with a straight face. "Don't you want to be hip?" "Hey, I'm hip," Wyatt protested. "I'm far hipper than any of you." "Please." Deck snorted. "You're like a rat snake with dysplasia, you're so unhip." "Snakes don't have hips," Ted pointed out. "Exactly." Wyatt's brows rose. That was a surprisingly good insult actually. But he shook his head. "The fact that you're using the word hip to argue about this, just proves you're hopeless when it comes to judging hipness." "Hey, you were the one who brought it up," Deck pointed out. "The point is, Wyatt," Ted dragged the conversation, kicking and screaming, back on track, "you always insisted you're not going to get married, but here you are, looking at Artie the same way I look at my Caroline." The reason Wyatt had always insisted that, was because there was only one woman he could ever imagine marrying, and he knew he'd never be able to have her. But then Jax had lost that bet, and the last 2 dates had been the best dates of Wyatt's life. That kiss had been the best kiss of his life, and he knew, if given the chance, if Jax wouldn't flip his gourd at the thought, Wyatt would marry Artie Weston in a heartbeat. Well, hell. He was going to lose that bet with his brothers and cousins, wasn't he? Chuckling, Deck slammed his hand down on Ted's shoulder. Look at the poor guy. Standing there holding a purse, mooning after his lady, who's in there working to save the future of the ranch. Ted hummed thoughtfully, then nodded. He's in love, all right. It's only our second date, Wyatt protested weakly. Have you kissed her? Deck asked. When Wyatt didn't answer, he chuckled. Definitely in love. Both of you shut up and focus on what's important, Wyatt growled, even though he knew they were both just teasing him to take their minds off what was going on in that stall. But as the minutes turned to hours, and they stood there, watching and praying, he kept remembering his brother and cousin's words. In love with Artie. And he suspected they were right. The sun was coming up. Wyatt's head rested against the outside wall of the stable, his butt planted on the concrete, as he watched through half-closed eyes as the eastern sky slowly turned pink. The moon had set hours ago, right around the time Bob and Ted had come out to tell him Moonbeam had given birth to 2 foals, and all 3 were doing well. They both looked pleased, but exhausted, and had headed home to their wives. Deck had followed, explaining he'd promised CJ he'd make pancakes, and bacon, of course, in the morning. See you at church, Wyatt had mumbled, half asleep himself. He'd been up and down all evening, between running out to Artie's van to drop off her purse and grab her midwifing bag, and offering support to his family when he could, but now he was content to just sit there and wait for her. It never once occurred to him to leave. He was so tired, he couldn't manage to do more than wave to Doc Phillips when the man left. But when Artie came out a few minutes later, Wyatt scrambled to his feet, suddenly revitalized. How'd it go? He asked, drawing her attention. She smiled wearily and changed directions, meeting him in the spill of light from the big stable door. 2 healthy fillies. They're small, but I think they'll be fine. Kate is in there fussing over them and trying to figure out the best supplements. I told him Mama's milk was best, and he said he'd just give Moonbeam the supplements. Grinning, she shook her head as she reached for his hand. And did you know Jim talks to the horses? Like some kind of horse whisperer or something? Wyatt was used to his cousin's oddities, knowing all the Cauldrons had their own quirks, but he wasn't going to stand for Jim being mocked, not even by her. So? Plenty of people talk to animals. Sure, I do it all the time. They began walking toward the parking area. But I've never had one answer me. I swear, Moonbeam seemed to understand exactly what he was saying, and I really think it's possible he understood her too. The doctor and I would tell Jim what we needed to happen, and he'd tell Moonbeam, and then she'd do it. It was wild. Yeah, Wyatt was interrupted by a yawn. Jim's special. Artie hummed in agreement, and they walked in silence for another few moments. When she spoke again, she sounded almost hesitant. If I hadn't seen that, I wouldn't have believed the next part. As soon as those foals were born, he got right down there with them, and let me tell you, a newborn animal isn't exactly pristine, but he pressed his forehead to theirs, and welcomed them. He was telling them all about the ranch and how special they were and how everyone loved them. And I swear they both understood him. Wyatt didn't confirm or deny it. Earlier in the summer, Ted had had the idea to see if Jim could speak with the unborn foals, but he'd been unable to. The guy was probably relieved to finally have the chance, so instead of answering, he merely said, "I'm really glad it went okay." "Yeah, me too." She sighed. They had almost reached the Jeep and her van when she suddenly squeezed his hand. "Hey, Doc Phillips was really nice. I like him a lot more than my boss." "Really?" "We worked well together, even though he didn't know me from Adam." "Eve. I believe he wouldn't know you from Eve." She snorted at the joke. "Oh, he'd know." Eve was naked. In the growing light, he shot her a look she couldn't possibly misinterpret. He wouldn't mind seeing her naked. He was pretty sure she blushed. Of course, Adam was naked too, but there'd be no way to confuse me with that. Wyatt chuckled softly and squeezed her hand again. "Anyhow, Doc Phillips told me that, if I was ever looking for work, he'd hire me on the spot. He said he was looking for a new tech anyhow, and now that he'd seen me in action, he knew we'd work well together on every call. They'd reached the vehicles, but that wasn't the only reason Wyatt tugged her to a stop and pulled her into his arms. "Artie, that's great. If she had a chance at work here in Cauldron Valley, maybe she'd move even closer." She snaked her arms around his neck. "I know." She beamed. "I've already told Jim I'm calling off Monday and Tuesday to be here for Moonbeam and her daughters. I think I'll just stay parked right here, so I can check on her." He leaned down and softly inhaled. She'd been working hard all night and looked exhausted, other than the excitement in her eyes. But somehow, she still managed to smell like peppermint. "I think that sounds fabulous," he murmured, his lips inches from hers. "It means I'll have you close by for the next few days." She hummed. "And what will you do with me close by?" "Well, I'm going to start by kissing you again, if that's all right." "Yes, please," she whispered, just before she surged up on her toes and caught his lips with hers. This kiss was soft and sweet and comforting, not at all hot and desperate like before. They both sighed as they pulled apart. Maybe it was the exhaustion, but as he pressed his forehead to hers, and breathed deeply, he felt, well, as if he were part of her. Which was crazy, because again, it was still their second date. But being with her, kissing her, felt right. "Ah, hell. I am in love with her, aren't I?" "I love kissing you, Wyatt," she whispered. With his eyes closed, he smiled. "Good, because I love kissing you." That was as good as I'd hoped it would be. "I think we could do even better." He snorted softly. "I dunno. That was a pretty awesome kiss. Wanna bet?" His eyes flashed open, and he slowly straightened. Those words never failed to make his heart pound, but this time, he knew there wasn't a real wager on the line. No matter what, he'd win. And so would she. So he lowered his chin until he was looking into her eyes. "There's something you should know about me, Artemis," he said seriously. "I never, ever, lose a bet." She hummed and ran her fingers through his hair. "I think I remember Jack's mentioning your love of gambling." "It's not a gamble. Gambling means there's a chance I could lose. But I don't lose." She cocked her head as she studied him. "Why not?" Shrugging, he tried to explain. "Jim seems to know what horses are thinking. Bob never makes a bad match. Ted can turn $1 into 10 in investments, without trying. And me? I just know when I'm going to win a bet, so I only take bets I know I'm going to win." She raised a brow. "So if I were to bet you I could kiss you hard enough to make you forget our earlier kiss, what would happen?" "I'd probably accept that bet, because frankly, there's no way I could lose." Instead of chuckling, she frowned slightly. "That's quite a talent. What was the last bet you won?" "I called you up to ask you out." He'd meant it as a brag, but as soon as the words were out of his mouth, he knew he'd made a mistake. In his arms, she stiffened so fast, he knew he'd upset her. "What?" she croaked. He hurried to explain. "Jack's bet me I couldn't call up a girl of his choosing and get a date from her. I didn't know it was you until I'd already pressed dial, and..." "No, wait, that made it sound worse." He shook his head. "Artie, I didn't mean. You asked me out on a dare? A wager?" She stepped out of his arms, backing toward her van. He shook his head again. "Artie, you don't understand." "What don't I understand, Wyatt?" "Because it sounds like you only asked me out because your best friend bet you that you couldn't." "Yeah, but he's your brother." Judging from the way she fumbled behind her for the door handle, that likely hadn't been the right thing to say either. Ugh. Why wasn't anything coming out right? He scrubbed a hand over his face, and tried to make his brain work properly, despite the exhaustion. "Look, Artie, I'm sorry. I didn't mean it that way." But she just shook her head sadly as she pulled open the van door. "Up until a few minutes ago, I would have told you this was the best date of my life, Wyatt," she whispered. "I had a great time with you. I got to bring 2 adorable animals into the world, and experienced some toe-curling kisses." At least, she'd thought they'd been toe-curling. Wyatt winced. "And now?" Artie climbed into the side of the van and began to close the door. At the last moment, she looked out at him, sorrow evident on every inch of her face. "Goodbye, Wyatt." And when the door slammed between them, his heart plummeted into his stomach. He'd just lost the best thing to ever happen to him, he was certain. Chapter 6. The knocking on the door woke Artie, and she groaned and pulled a pillow over her head. Why was it so bright? And why did her mouth taste as if she'd been licking a sheep? And why did her eyes hurt? Oh, yeah, she'd been crying when she'd finally fallen asleep. When she remembered that morning's events, sorrow creeped back through her blood. No, not exactly sorrow, but more like defeat. What did she expect? That the man she'd had a crush on for 15 years would suddenly just call her up out of the blue and demand a date because he wanted to? Fat chance. The pounding came again. "Artemis Weston, you open this door right now." That was her sister's voice, but Artie didn't want to get up, didn't want to even pull the pillow off her head to find out what time it was. She felt as if she hadn't slept enough, but it was likely mid-afternoon at least. "It's probably not locked. Check it." That was Bobby's voice, and sure enough, the door handle rattled. "We don't care if you're decent or not, Artie, we're coming in." When the van's door slid open, Artie winced under her pile of pillows. "Go away," she mumbled. "She lives," cried Bobby. Arya groaned as she climbed into the van. "Why in creation can't you live in an apartment like a normal person?" "Because that'd be too much space for her to junk up," Bobby replied. "Look at this. Is this a newspaper? Who reads newspapers anymore? And I think this is a burrito wrapper. And it looks as though either a rodent got into her Halloween candy stash, or she was." With an irritated grunt, Artie fought her way out of the pillows and sat up, glaring at her friend and sister. "It's not Halloween candy if you buy it in July, doofus." Bobby, who was still standing outside the door, her head and shoulders inside the van, grinned in response. "Good morning, sunshine. You look like dog poop. It's 3 in the afternoon, and we're here to drag you from your misery." Artie scrubbed a hand down her face. "Who says dog poop anyhow?" "Someone with a precocious 6-year-old who started repeating me, and you, I might add, Miss Potty Mouth, before her first birthday." Scowling, Artie mumbled, "I swear, I say donkey farts one stinking time, and you're never going to let me forget it, are you?" "Nope," Bobby said cheerfully. "I left CJ with Decker today though, so he's got to watch his language, and I don't. They're putting the final touches on one of the saddles he's donating to the church to auction off at the summer fair." She held up a folded camp chair. "Anyhow, I brought my own chair, so I don't have to sit in your mess. I'll be waiting outside here, while you get your lazy butt up." Arya had meanwhile moved to the back of the van and sat down on the bed. "You're on my foot," Artie grunted. Her sister shrugged. "It's a small space. I got your text this morning, but figured I should let you sleep. Hope it's okay, I picked up Bobby on the way over." She held up a bag and 3 spoons. "I brought ice cream." Artie had to admit the offering sounded awesome. "If I want said ice cream, I'm going to have to divulge all, is that the deal?" "As always." Arya patted her knee. "But you can't come outside wearing just a tank top and panties, so put on some clothes and join us." "I have to pee." "Then get up and pee, and then put clothes on." Artie rolled her eyes. "I would, sister dearest, but you're still sitting on my foot." Of course Arya didn't apologize, but she did stand with a huff and shuffle toward the front of the vehicle. In no time at all, Artie was sitting on her own camp chair, her feet propped up on the van's stairwell, scooping mint chocolate chip ice cream into her mouth. Ice cream for breakfast. I could get used to this." Bobby, who was sitting beside her, peered down at her own cookies and cream. "You know what would go well with this? Bacon." Despite the heaviness of her heart, Artie had to chuckle. 2 months ago, you were all about the leafy greens. Decker must have really changed you." Her best friend shrugged. "I'm a convert. Bacon really is the heavenly meat, as he calls it. And it goes well with spinach and eggs, so it's practically healthy." Arya was sitting in the passenger seat, her feet propped up on the dash, daintily enjoying her strawberry ice cream. But now, she pointed her spoon at Bobby. Loving someone can change your mind about a lot of things, huh? Loving someone. And just like that, Artie's mood soured, remembering what Wyatt had said that morning. So, Ariadne, have you been keeping up with your sister for the last week? Bobby asked innocently. All I know is that there's some guy she's totally had the hots for like years, and he asked her out, and she had a great time. Bobby hummed and stabbed her ice cream with the spoon again. And have you noticed how over the moon she's seemed the last week, since her first date? Arya gasped, dramatically. You know, now that you mention it, I have. And they had another date last night. Did you know that? I do. Bobby waved the full spoon at Arya, both of them ignoring Artie and having a whole conversation about her, as if she weren't sitting right there. We had a big event last night, one of the ranch's Maras gave birth to twins. Decker said Artie was there all night, helping. Arya agreed, then swallowed. And then I got a text this morning about how the world had ended, and my sister was completely shattered and would never recover and... Oh, for Pete's sake. Shut up, you two. Artie rolled her eyes. I wasn't that bad. Yes you were, Arya said, at the same time Bobby asked innocently, who's Pete? To answer your questions, Artie ticked off the points with her fingers. 1. Yes, last week's date went awesome. 2. The last week has been really cool, with Wyatt and me texting. He makes me smile. 3. Date number 2 last night was even better, if you'll all shut up long enough for me to get a word in edgewise. 4. We got back here last night in time for me to help with Moonbeam's birth, and it was one of the most magical experiences of my life. 5. He kissed me, yes it was wonderful. 6. You've run out of fingers, Bobby interrupted unhelpfully. Artie scowled and grabbed her spoon again. Frowning down at her ice cream, she felt tears gather in her eyes once more. And 6, this morning, I think he might have broken my heart. After a long moment, the silence broken only by Artie chewing the ice cream, Arya finally said, so, if he broke your heart, does that mean you love him? Artie sniffled quietly. I might have. I did. Yeah, but I've been in love with him for years, remember? But in the last week, you got to know the real him, huh? Her sister asked quietly. Artie thought about last night. About realizing the man she'd crushed on so badly was infinitely more wonderful than she'd imagined. Wyatt Cauldron was sweet, and read books, and watched romantic movies until he had them memorized. He'd cooked delicious food, for her, and made her feel like a princess. Honey, Bobby said softly, why don't you tell us? So she did. Her sister and her best friend sat and listened as the whole story came pouring out. Artie told about her date, and how he made her feel, and the kiss. Then she told them what she'd learned that morning, how Wyatt had only asked her out as part of a wager. And how he never lost a wager. Bobby didn't say anything after Artie was finished, but Arya was angry enough for both of them. That weasel. And to think we're related. How could our brother do that? When I see Jax, I'm going to give him a big piece of my mind. But Artie shrugged. Jax has always made it really clear we weren't allowed to date any of his friends, remember? I dunno what he was thinking when he made that bet. She poked at her ice cream sadly. I guess he didn't know me very well, to think I'd turn down a date with Wyatt. Bobby hummed thoughtfully. When the sisters turned to look at her, she shrugged. Maybe he knows you better than you think. What's that supposed to mean? Arya snapped. Artie's best friend held up her spoon defensively. Did Wyatt have a chance to explain himself this morning? Remembering how hurt she'd been, and how she'd slammed the van door in his face, Artie felt a flush of heat cover her cheeks. No, not really, she mumbled. Bobby shrugged again. All I'm saying is... Look. She sighed and scraped at the bottom of her ice cream container. You know what else would go well with this? Pickles. Pickles? Arya burst out. What the heck does that have to do with? Nothing, sorry, Bobby hurried to explain. But look, she caught Artie's gaze. You know all those books you used to lend me? The romances? Contemporary or historical? And what did it matter? Bobby flicked her fingers dismissively. Either. Both. You know the trope where there's a stupid miscommunication, and one character thinks something about the other character, and the other doesn't realize it, and they go like half the book with this stupidness between them? Slowly, Artie nodded. And you know how we used to make fun of those characters, Bobby continued, because the whole damn crisis could have been easily solved, if the two idiots had just sat down and talked about things? Now who has the potty mouth? Arya muttered. But Artie was reluctantly nodding along. I remember. Bobby pointed her spoon at Artie's nose. All I'm saying is, this isn't a romance novel, hon. You don't have to put up with some stupid, contrived misunderstanding. Don't make us wait until chapter 10, or whatever, for you two to have a real conversation about this. If you like the man, heck, if you think you might even love him, or one day could fall in love with him, then you need to go talk to him. Artie's gaze dropped to her half-full container. Talk to him? Was Bobby right? Should she have given Wyatt the chance to defend himself? Could there be another reason for his actions? Or something else behind them? She couldn't see how, but Bobby was right. If this had been one of those romance novels she was always reading, then it'd be stupid to draw the conflict out over the next half-dozen chapters, just because she refused to talk about it. You know, if this were a romance novel, she finally said with a sigh, as she met her bestie's eyes, you'd be my older and wiser friend, the secondary character who already got her romance. Bobby's brown eyes twinkled as she nodded. And you'd wise up right around the midpoint and start paying attention to me. But I'm not older, remember. Just wiser? Infinitely wiser, Artie snorted, just as her sister spoke up. If this were a romance, I'd be the sassy secondary character. Maybe I can be the one who saves the heroines, but... Nah, the hero has to do that, Bobby corrected. You'd be the one who was introduced solely so the audience can get to know her. Then she gets to be the heroine of a future book. Arya burst into giggles. No, thank you. I love my life the way it is. Henry burned me, and I have no intention on letting another guy lie to me like that. And besides, maybe the heroine saves the hero in this book. Maybe, Bobby agreed. It's important to give the heroine agency in her future. Yeah, Artie was warming to the idea. Maybe the heroine could give the hero a taste of his own medicine. What are you thinking? Her best friend suddenly looked worried as she eyed Artie. But Artie shrugged. I dunno yet. I'll know it when I see it. But you are going to talk to him? Wyatt, I mean, not our imaginary hero? I thought Wyatt was the hero? Arya sounded confused. Bobby flicked her fingers again. It doesn't matter. Are you going to talk to him, Artie? Talk to him. He'd only asked her out on a date because he didn't want to lose a bet to Jax. But... She sighed. Maybe. Arya glared at her, until Artie offered another, louder, put-upon sigh. Fine. I'll talk to him. But, she pushed away her container of ice cream, her stomach flipping over. But not right now. Tomorrow, her sister urged. Artie shrugged, then nodded. Fine. Tomorrow. Better to let him stew a bit. Her sister nodded emphatically and sat back in her seat, obviously satisfied. Bobby, however, pointed to Artie's half-eaten ice cream. You going to finish that? And do you have any corn chips to go with it? Ooh, or peanut butter? The insides of Wyatt's eyelids felt like sandpaper. He was fairly sure that, although he'd taken a shower and laid down in bed, he hadn't actually slept. Nope, instead, he'd just spent all day kicking himself for being so stupid. Of course, he wasn't sure what he'd been stupid about. Stupid because he'd told Artie about the bet? No, she would have eventually found out, and it was better to have come from him, right? Stupid because he didn't try harder to explain the whole mess? Or stupid because he'd taken the bet in the first place? Sighing, he scrubbed his hand over his face and shuffled into the stables. He wasn't certain what had possessed him to check on Moonbeam. It wasn't as if Jim was going to leave her alone or anything, but he'd been out walking, trying to clear his head for the last hour anyhow. "Hiya, Wyatt." Seth, Jim's right-hand man, gave him a friendly nod. "You're not at the picnic?" "Picnic?" Wondering why his brain didn't seem to be firing on all cylinders, Wyatt shook his head. I just came to check on the foals." With a smile, Seth jerked his head toward Moonbeam's stall. He tipped his chair back against the wall and smiled happily. "They're doing just fine, but I think they're all resting right now. I just took a peek a few minutes ago." Wyatt poked his head in, and sure enough, the three animals looked nice and cozy. "And darned cute." He nodded his thanks to Seth. But before he left, still not sure where he was heading, he turned back. Picnic?" The other man raised a brow. "Sure. Instead of your usual Sunday dinner tonight, Mr. Cauldron, your grandfather, declared a celebration and invited the entire ranch, seems like." Jim didn't want to leave Moonbeam, but his wife told him if he didn't go, Tessa wouldn't make her famous lemonade, which would upset your grandfather, and, chuckling, he shook his head, then continued in his southern drawl. "Well, it doesn't matter. I told Jim I'd stand guard, just as long as he brings me one of Griselda's cupcakes. I hear she's been baking all day." Wyatt fumbled to pull his phone out of his back pocket. Oh, hell, there were at least 30 unread notifications. He must have put it on silent during his attempt at taking a nap and forgotten about it. Scrolling through the texts, he saw Seth was right. Sometimes, when Pops really wanted to celebrate something, he threw a big shindig like this, instead of their usual weekly dinner, and invited the ranch family, as he called the hands and their families. But, with a sigh, Wyatt accepted the truth. He had no desire to go celebrate anything tonight. He nodded his thanks to Seth. "Have a good night." The good-natured man waved cheerfully and went back to his crossword puzzle, and Wyatt, with nothing better to do, and the sun already sinking low in the west, shuffled back toward his lonely little apartment over his office at the racetrack. In his hand, the phone still buzzed occasionally, as his family sent texts back and forth, but he couldn't bear to read them. Instead, he flopped into his recliner and scowled at the ceiling. In his lap, the phone buzzed twice in a row, then a third time after a few seconds of silence. "What?" he snapped out loud, snatching it up. "What's so important?" The third text had been from Jax. "Hey man, you okay?" Wyatt dropped his feet to the floor and leaned forward, bracing his elbows on his knees, as he simply stared at the screen. Was he okay? No, he damn well was not okay, and the worst part was, he knew it was all his own fault. Finally, he forced his fingers into motion. "Why?" Jax replied almost immediately. "Just got a nasty text from Ariadne. She heard about the bet, which means Artie knows." Wyatt's fingers shook as he typed, "Yeah." A moment passed before Jax's reply popped up. "So, are you okay?" With a sigh, Wyatt began typing. "No, but I guess I'll live. I'm angry, I was so stupid. I just wish I'd had the chance to explain." Explain he'd been waiting 10 years for the chance to ask her on a date, and that by making the bet, her older brother had given him the permission he'd been hoping for. "So, you gonna call my little sister and explain everything?" Wyatt snorted softly, staring down at the screen of the phone dangling from his hands. If only it were that simple. 3 little dots showed up on the screen, indicating Jax was typing. Then his words popped up. "Hey, Don Juan, just talk to her. She's reasonable." Wyatt's fingers fumbled across the phone's keyboard. "Talk to her like you and I are doing now?" "Haha. Fine, text her. Just don't give up on her, Wyatt." Wyatt frowned. Jax was sounding awfully concerned for a man who'd lost a bet, and also for someone who knew Wyatt had dated his sister more than the one time agreed upon. He should be crowing that Wyatt had failed when it came to dating Artie, not sounding so invested. Of course, maybe he realized Wyatt was hurting and didn't want to rub it in. They had been friends for 15 years after all. So he took a deep breath and wrote, "Thanks, man," to his best friend. This was as close as either was going to come to admitting they cared for one another. True to form, Jax replied with a thumbs up, and Wyatt snorted again as he shook his head. Modern communication is a hell of a thing, huh? Maybe it'd be best to get it done now, while he was psyched up for it. Before he got psyched out. He pulled up Artie's number, and there was the last text she'd sent, yesterday afternoon, when they'd been arranging their date. Their amazing, wonderful, perfect, horrible date. It took him 3 tries to text her. Thank goodness he reread them all, because each one he ended up deleting for being too wordy or desperate sounding. There was really only one thing she needed to hear at that moment. "I'm sorry." He pressed send, then stared at his phone, willing her to see it. Willing her to care enough to maybe, possibly, forgive him. He exhaled and leaned back in his chair. He should get up and make himself something to eat. Maybe he'd have the leftovers from the snacks he'd made her yesterday, which were sitting in containers in the fridge, but he wasn't really hungry and didn't care enough to eat, to be honest. All he could think about was how badly he'd blown it. And then his phone buzzed, and he scrambled to lift it and pull open the text app. She'd replied. "I'm sorry too." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something. Chapter 7. Mid-afternoon on Monday, Artie found herself carefully cradling a casserole dish and ducking behind the racetrack's concession stand to avoid one of the ranch employees heading toward her. She wasn't sure why it mattered so much she not be seen, but here she was, crouched beside the fake butter dispenser. When the man's footsteps receded, she peeked her head out. Coast is clear. The man had been coming from the direction of Wyatt's office, and maybe that's why Artie had been so nervous. She was about to head up there and didn't want him to have any advanced warning. Or maybe she just wanted the freedom to chicken out at the last moment. Taking a deep breath, she inhaled some of the garlic scent from the dish in her hands. Griselda had insisted it was Wyatt's favorite and would be the perfect way to convince the man to open up. This was after convincing Artie Wyatt had a need to open up. "I can't believe I cooked the man lasagna. I can't believe I cooked, period." She squeezed her eyes shut. What was she thinking? Wyatt had taken a bet to date her. He didn't deserve her lasagna. But some of the things Griselda had said. Well, here goes. Before she lost her nerve, Artie took a deep breath and rushed toward his office. Reaching the door, she balanced the dish on one hip and knocked smartly. It swung open. "Well, in for a penny, in for a pound." "Hello," she called tentatively, sticking her head into the space. It was chaotic, with boxes, marked everything from popcorn to ticket stubs, to uniforms, stacked all over the place. There was what appeared to be a small seating area, but it was currently covered in shiny satins of different colors, as if someone had laid them out to catch the light. One wall of windows looked out over the racetrack, but in the absence of a race, they were hung with printed papers taped to the glass. One corner was obviously Wyatt's desk, which held 2 computer monitors, a pile of ledgers, and a half-empty glass of water. But, no Wyatt. She stood in the center of the space, craning her neck, wondering if some of the boxes hid entrances to other rooms, or possibly other dimensions. But nope, he just plain wasn't there. She edged closer to the desk and craned her neck around. There was a pad of paper with a bunch of scribbles on it. She recognized her name and leaned closer, balancing the dish in 2 hands. "Dear Artie. I'm so sorry. It was a stupid, I know I shouldn't have made that. I want you to know I've liked." The rest of the paper was scratched out so well, she couldn't read any of it. Glancing at the garbage can, she saw crumbled pieces of paper that might have come off this pad. Had he sat here, trying to compose a letter to her? An apology? She straightened, inhaling deeply and finding her courage. Bobby had been right. Clearly they needed to talk this out. And judging from some of those jotted notes, Artie wondered if Griselda was right as well. Glancing again at the glass of water, the ice still causing condensation to form on the outside, Artie realized Wyatt couldn't have gone far. Didn't he live above his office? Unbidden, her gaze rose to the ceiling. Was he up in his apartment? Dare she interrupt him, whatever he was doing? She glanced down at the casserole dish. She'd made him lasagna. At this point, she'd dare anything. Determined not to take the coward's way out, she marched to the far wall and began wrenching open doors. One led to a short hall with 2 restrooms and what looked like a dressing room, but her second try led to a stairwell. Swallowing, she straightened her shoulders and started up. At the top, there was another small hall with a door at the end. This time, she used her foot to knock, the sound echoing decisively. In the ensuing silence, Artie was certain she could hear her own heartbeat. But she didn't have time to get freaked out, or chicken out, or any other words pairing without, because there was someone on the other side of the door, his hand on the knob. When Wyatt opened the door, he was halfway through pulling a t-shirt over his head, and she had the most wonderful glimpse of smooth abs disappearing under the faded green cotton. The sight reminded her of the summer Jax had brought Wyatt home from college, and she'd watched them practicing their football drills out in the yard. And when his head finally popped out of the neck hole, he looked as wonderfully rumpled and sexy as she remembered back then. "What's, Artie?" "Here," she blurted, shoving the casserole dish into his hands, forcing him to take it, or let it drop. "This is for you." His confused green gaze dropped to the dish, and he lifted the edge of the foil. "Lasagna?" His expression lit up as he met her eyes once more. "This is my favorite." She shrugged again, then shoved her hands in the pockets of her shorts. "That's what Griselda said." He was back to looking confused. "Griselda made me lasagna?" Listen, is there someplace we can talk?" "Artemis," he said sincerely, as his shoulders dropped in relief, "there's nothing I would like more." "Do you, He stepped back into this apartment, jerking his head to invite her in. "Do you want to come in?" Hesitantly, she stepped inside. His apartment was better organized than the office downstairs, or maybe there was just less stuff. She saw a small kitchen, which Wyatt was currently backing toward, a card table with mismatched chairs, and a beat-up sofa and recliner. There was a hall leading toward the rear, a bedroom, and the door to the bathroom stood half open. Her first reaction was to smile. He wasn't exactly messy, he just didn't see a need for fancy stuff, and she could appreciate that. She lived in a van, for Pete's sake. Do you want something to eat?" He lifted the pan. "Truthfully?" She blew out a breath. "No. My stomach's in knots, and I've been snacking all afternoon." His smile looked a little forced. "Ah, yes, snackies, the 5th food group." "5th? Does that mean there's normally 4? He blinked and looked a little confused. "Yeah. Right? 4 food groups?" He shook his head. "I think there's 4. Guacamole, corn products, dessert, and..." He shrugged. "Queso?" They shared a smile, and it felt nice. He lifted the dish just a bit. "If you don't want to join me, do you mind if I stick this in the oven?" Griselda's lasagna tastes awesome cold or reheated, don't get me wrong, but I'll savor it later. When she shook her head, not sure how to say what she came to say, he turned and opened the oven with one hand. While he was bent over the oven, she blurted out, "I made the lasagna." He jerked, and slammed his head against the lip of the counter. Before she could do more than wince, he'd kicked the oven door closed and was turning to her, rubbing the back of his head. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I'm fine." Why did? Her hands were out of her pockets as she hurried toward him. "Do you need ice?" "I can get you some ice." But he was shaking his head. "I'm okay. I just..." "Medical attention?" Reaching him, she peered up at him in concern. "Want me to call someone?" "I normally work with animals, but I could take a look." "Artie." He took her hands, probably to keep her from grabbing his head. "Artie." "I'm fine." "Oh." His green eyes flicked between hers, as if looking for the truth. "You made me the lasagna?" Mutely, she nodded. "Why?" he whispered. She swallowed and pulled her hands from his grasp, but once she did, she felt bereft. Cold. So she laced her fingers together in front of her and hoped she didn't look like a complete idiot. I didn't plan to. I just went for a walk this morning, toward the main house, and I met Griselda. She dropped her gaze to Wyatt's chest. Turns out, she's really easy to talk to. He snorted softly. Yeah, she is. Clumsy as anything, but she can get you talking like nobody's business. Did you tell her what I did? Artie swallowed. I told her about the bet. I didn't mean to. When I met her, I kinda thought. Oh, I dunno. She snuck a peek up at him, but when she realized he was staring intently down at her, she dropped her gaze to her hands. I'm not a very good cook, she whispered, but after talking to her, I had this idea of making you something. Like a peace offering. Lasagna? Her breath escaped her in a cross between a laugh and a huff, and she thought about that note she'd seen down in his office. She looked up once more. I thought maybe something simple, but I'm hopeless. Then Griselda was telling me lasagna is your favorite, and somehow, I found myself sitting there in the kitchen with her, learning how to make lasagna. Wyatt's eyes were wide, his shock evident, as he glanced at the oven. I hurt you, Artie. And you learned to make my favorite meal in response? Shaking his head, he reached for her hands once more. You really are remarkable, Artemis Weston. Thank you. She didn't pull away this time. Because Griselda had taught her more than just how to make lasagna. The old woman had only been with the Cauldron household for a few years, but she knew all about Wyatt and his brothers and cousins, thanks to her friendship with their grandmother. She shared some very interesting things with Artie. Which is why she was there. To see if they were true. But she was too antsy to stand still. Do you mind if we, I dunno, go for a walk or something? I think that'd be great. Hold on. He gave her hands a squeeze, then stepped around her. As he hurried toward the bedroom, she realized he was barefoot. There was something really intimate, and damned sexy, about a man's bare feet peeking out of a pair of blue jeans. In a moment, he was back with a pair of socks and his boots. He plopped down on the sofa and scrambled to pull them on, while she watched awkwardly, unsure what to say. Then he was standing, wiping his palms on his thighs and looking as hesitant as she felt. Shall we? He gestured toward the door. Jerking her head up and down a few times, I probably look like a caffeinated parrot, she ducked out and hurried down the stairs. In a moment, they were both standing outside his office. After he pulled the door shut, he took her hand, and without a word, began to walk. Within minutes, the track had disappeared behind them, and they walked over a little rise. Instantly, Artie felt herself relax as the beauty of Montana surrounded her. She loved it there, loved the way the hills, covered in big boulders, turned into mountains and buttes without you noticing, loved the way the scrub pine could make the land look smooth in the distance, loved the way all the sounds seemed at once muted and more amplified, out here, away from man-made buildings. Maybe she should have been nervous, to be in such seclusion with a man she'd only been on 2 dates with. But this was Wyatt. And when he took her hand, she exhaled and found herself smiling. Artie. He suddenly pulled her to a stop. Artie, I can't believe you cooked for me. I have questions, but there's something I need to tell you first. She nodded, not saying anything, but tilting her head back to hold his gaze. I want you to know, Lord in heaven, you're beautiful. She blinked. Sorry, no, that wasn't what I mean, it's true, but that's not what I was supposed to say. He shook his head, then dragged his free hand through his hair. I mean, I'm supposed to say it, and I promise I will say it, as often as possible, but it's not. Gah. It was pretty cute, the way he got so flustered. So she squeezed his hand and willed him to tell her what he needed to say. And prayed it was what Griselda had promised. He took a deep breath and met her eyes. Artemis, I've liked you for a long time. Since I was in college, and you were in high school, there was this one summer when Jax invited me home to stay for a week, and, never mind. It doesn't matter when it started. One corner of his lips pulled up sheepishly. What's important, is that I've known you for a long time, but there was a moment when I suddenly started seeing you as, well, as someone who was not just my best friend's little sister. And something inside of Artie clicked into place. She breathed in through her nose, the wonderful scents of Montana and Wyatt's aftershave merging into sheer perfection. And she smiled. As he reached for her other hand, he continued, I know I sound like I'm blathering, and I'm sorry. But, I like you. I mean, I've liked you. You're hot, yeah, but you've got this energy and passion, and I love the way you smile, and, he shook his head, that rueful smile back in place. I'm making a mess of this. Taking a deep breath, he lifted her hands, until he could brush his lips across the backs of her knuckles, and held her gaze. I used to ask Jax about you all the time until he got wise. He made it really clear he wouldn't stand for me dating you, or any of his sisters, and I respected that, and him, too much to ask you out, even when we were both old enough for a serious relationship. So when he made that bet, he shrugged. You took it, she finished in a whisper. He kissed her knuckles again. I took it. It was a stupid wager anyway. There were no stakes. After I pressed send, he told me who I was calling, and in that moment, I was more terrified than I can ever remember being. But I also felt, I dunno. Blessed, maybe? Given the opportunity of a lifetime. Jax probably didn't count on you saying yes, or he wouldn't have made the wager. Artie slowly smiled. Griselda told me if I gave you the chance, you'd tell me this. That I've liked you for years? She nodded, her fingers tightening around his. She said you weren't going to hide the truth from me, because you're, and I quote, a good boy who has been waiting for his opportunity. Do you? He swallowed, his eyes caressing her features. Can you forgive me, Artie? There's nothing to forgive you for. I might kick Jax next time I see him, but not you. Kick him for making the bet? Kick him for keeping us apart. Slowly, he pulled her hands to his shoulders, placing them there. Then, just as slowly, he dropped his hands to her hips, as if anchoring her in place. Does that mean what I think it means, Artemis? She nodded. If this had been a romance novel, one of those books she and Bobby sometimes shared back and forth, she might have dragged this out, making him writhe with uncertainty. But she knew the truth, and he deserved to know it too. I know the summer you're talking about, Wyatt, because that was the first time I ever saw you shirtless. His brows went up. You spied on us when we did drills? Biting her lip, she nodded. Then, figuring she might as well tell him everything, she dropped her gaze to his chin. I'd had the hots for you even before then, she whispered. But after that, I saw you as a man, I guess. He let out a small moan and tugged her flush against him. When she inhaled, her breasts pushed against his chest, causing her nipples to harden in the most wonderful way. Pressed against her belly, his blue jean-encased hardness told her exactly how he saw her. Excellent. She surged up on her toes, pressing her lips against his and twining her arms around his neck. With a groan, he wrapped his arms across her back and pulled her up against him. He tasted as good as she remembered. Hours, eons, or maybe only a few dozen heartbeats later, they stood, arms around one another, her cheek pressed against his shoulder, breathing in time. If his libido was anything like hers, he was showing remarkable restraint. So, he blew out a breath. Now what do we do? She smiled. You want to go on a date? A surprised laugh burst out of him. Do I? Heck yes, I do. He pulled back just enough to grab her hand. Dinner? Nodding, she didn't think her smile could get any bigger. Maybe, oh, I dunno, lasagna? He peered at her. Is it any good? It depends. Do you like garlic? Because I think there was a little accident with the garlic. There might be too much. Smiling, he tugged her into motion. There's no such thing as too much garlic in lasagna. They were walking away from his office and apartment, and that was fine with her. It was a beautiful afternoon, and she was just thrilled to be spending it with him. After all, she had to head back to Black Aces and work in a few days, now that Moonbeam was doing well. No such thing as too much garlic? You maybe should hold off saying that until you taste it. I mistook the quarter-cup measuring cup for the tablespoon. Without glancing at her, he lifted her hand to his lips, and she could feel his smile. It's going to taste amazing, Artie. I suppose you're going to expect me to kiss you after you eat all this garlic, huh? Chuckling, he shot her a glance, and she loved how relaxed he was. I guess it's only fair that you eat a bunch of it too, so we smell equally bad. Smell? It's how we taste I'm worried about. She gave a little yelp when he tugged her into his arms, his kiss surprising her. Before she had a chance to melt into it, he pulled back, grinning. You taste fine to me, Artemis. Divine, if you will. It took her a moment to get the joke, a reference to her goddess name, but when she did, she snorted and rolled her eyes. She smacked his chest, smiling easily. So as long as we both eat my lasagna, we'll be fine? Better than fine, Artie, he whispered, then dropped a kiss to the corner of her mouth. Before she had a chance to relax against him, he was moving again. Are we going to walk around the entire ranch? Only half of it, he teased. Then his expression turned to concern. Why? Are you hungry? We can head back now if. He'd already turned, but she just shook her head. I just wanted to make sure you hadn't lost your sense of direction with that blow to the head. I can still take a look at it, you know. Chuckling, he winked at her. I'm fine, really, unless I suddenly start speaking Gaelic, or can't make every shot at the ping-pong booth at the summer fair, or something. Then we'll know something is wrong. Oh really? Those are your only two indicators? Yep. Those two, and if I ever do anything to drive you away. He kissed her hand again as they walked. I've liked you half my life, Artie, and I'd never do anything to ruin my chance with you. Heart. Melt. He was easy to fall in love with. She cleared her throat. So tell me more about this summer fair. Their walk lasted another hour and ended at the stables. She officially introduced him to Moonbeam's two daughters, and just about melted when he spoke softly to each foal and stroked their necks gently. Then they headed back to his apartment for dinner. Her lasagna wasn't as bad as she'd worried, and Wyatt kept making a big deal out of how great it tasted. They laughed a lot and made plans for more dates that week, and by the end of the evening, she knew. She knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, she was in love with Wyatt Cauldron. Chapter 8. Dating Artie was the best thing that had ever happened to him, and thanks to fate, or God, or just her good sense, he was given a second chance to enjoy it. Sometimes Wyatt woke up in the middle of the night, cringing over how close he'd come to losing her. But thank God she was level-headed enough to come to him, to be willing to listen, and she'd done it with a gift of homemade lasagna, which still flabbergasted him. She was a special woman, and he was blessed to be a part of her life. But the more time he spent with her, the antsier it made him that, well, he couldn't quite identify it. The feeling had something to do with being a part of her life. She was the focus of his entire being right now, and they were just dating. Some nights he went to Black Aces, where they could go out to eat without superstitious townspeople licking their fingers to ward off bad luck. Sometimes she came to his apartment and they cooked together. It was hilarious watching her try to learn the difference between the measuring cups and spoons, and there'd been at least one meal they'd given up on and ordered takeout. Sometimes they picnicked, sometimes they just went for walks together and talked. He learned all about her family, and she seemed obsessed with hearing stories about his childhood and the crazy pranks he'd pulled on Pops and Grams. She hadn't met Pops yet, but that was Wyatt's fault. With the way his brothers and cousins had all married so quickly, he knew Pops would take one look at Artie and start crowing. Pops would declare Artie to be Wyatt's the one, and he'd have to explain that, no, he couldn't marry her because he'd made a bet with Cade, Decker, Bob, Jim and Ted that he wouldn't be marrying. And Wyatt Cauldron did not lose bets. But the more time they spent together, the more times he kissed her and touched her, the more he cursed his talent. If only he'd had some warning not to take that bet. He'd had that tingling feeling, because he'd known he'd never marry, since Artie was off limits. It had been an easy wager to take, knowing he'd win. But damn, Artie made his life worth living. Last Friday, after they finished the nachos they'd made together, and sat, groaning, on his beat-up sofa, she'd looked around, and said, "I know you've got enough money to outfit this place nicer, Wyatt." He'd grinned. "Your brother said almost exactly the same thing. We Westons can be pretty smart, I guess." He hadn't been so sure about that. It had been a few weeks since he'd last seen Jax, since the night of the bed actually, but he had texted his friend after Artie brought him the lasagna. He'd just sent, "Things are good," and his best friend had texted back, "Cool, man." Shaw. Who says men don't talk about their feelings? After her teasing him about his apartment and its lack of style, he'd taken Artie into Helena over the weekend, and she'd helped him pick out new furniture. A completely new set of furniture, kitchen, family room, bedroom sets, everything. It felt right to be standing there in the furniture store with her, picking everything out together. They'd teased, they'd laughed, and when they'd gotten to the beds, well, she tackled him and they'd ended up all but making out, right there on one of the mattresses. "I'll take this one," he'd gasped, when she finally let him up for air, both of them grinning like fools. Yeah, things were pretty awesome, and he was really looking forward to walking around the church's summer festival with her on his arm, despite the superstitious yahoos in town. Each summer, Pastor Dinkelheimler had the ladies of the church put on a big fair to solicit donations. This year, the hall building needed a new roof, so all the money raised would go to that. Most of Caudron Valley's ladies, including Griselda and a few of Wyatt's new sisters-in-law, had been baking for days in preparation, and there were a lot of artisans and crafters who'd agreed to donate a larger-than-normal percentage of profits from their sales to the church. Wyatt was looking forward to strolling around, spending money for a good cause, and having fun. When he met Artie in the parking lot, he'd discovered there were many benefits to her living in a house which was mobile. She was scowling. "What's wrong?" he asked, offering her his hand and trying not to stare at how good she looked in that little gray sundress, streaked through with shimmering silver threads. She looked exactly as he'd always imagined a moon goddess would look. She blew out an exasperated breath and stretched up on her toes to give him a quick kiss. "Sorry. It's nothing. You can tell me." She flicked her fingers and turned around to pull her purse from the driver's seat. He didn't even bother pretending he wasn't staring at her. "But I had a disagreement with my boss. I'm not sure how much longer I can work there, to be honest." He shrugged and took her hand. "Well, you could always come to Cauldron Valley and work for Doc Phillips. He did offer you a position, remember?" Her expression brightened. "Yeah, you're right. Maybe I should call him up." As they headed toward the fair, Wyatt jerked his chin over his shoulder. "And since you live in the camper van, it wouldn't be that much trouble to pick up and move. Plus, you'd be closer to me." When she giggled and released his hand to link her arm through his heart soared. Pastor Dinkelheimler's wife was taking tickets and money at the gate, and as soon as she saw them, she licked her fingers and shoved them in the air. But she was smiling when she nodded a greeting. "I just took some money from your brother Decker. He's in there already." Wyatt nodded. "Did you meet his wife, Bobby Cauldron?" Mrs. Dinkelheimler had to lower her hand to lick her fingers again, before thrusting them back into the air. "I met her at the wedding, remember?" "Ah, that's right. I think she's pleased to be part of the Cauldron family." Her fingers went back into her mouth and shot high into the sky for the third time. "How many tickets do you want, young man?" she asked, her tone frostier. Maybe she'd picked up on his teasing, so he made short work of buying a bunch of tickets. He couldn't wait to show off his ping-pong skills to Artie later, and the couple headed through the gate. Artie burst into giggles. "What was that? You've never heard of our town's silly habits? They have to lick their fingers to ward off our bad triplet luck. Jax told me once, but I'd never seen it. That's disgusting." She was touching money, and then, EW. He shrugged. "God made dirt and dirt don't hurt." "Yeah, but he also made flu germs and other icky stuff. This is how epidemics get started. By licking your fingers to ward off bad luck?" Still giggling, she pressed her face into his shoulder as they strolled. "That'd probably be even worse luck for you, huh?" "Oh, they'd find a way to blame the seasonal flu on us if they could, I'm sure." Wyatt, remind me never to go out to eat in Cauldron Valley with you. I don't want to have to worry about them licking my food accidentally. Deal. He was smiling, loving their banter. Where should we go first? She pointed. Artisan's Row. I want to see my sister. So with her tugging him along, Wyatt soon found himself in front of a booth containing some of Artemis Weston's beautiful knit creations. Amazed, he picked up a delicate shawl, which looked as if it had been spun from spider silk. This is beautiful, he murmured, turning it this way and that. Almost ephemeral. Artie's sister was busy with a customer, but sent him a smile. Artie herself bounced over, holding a framed photograph. Look at how cute these turned out. She showed him the photos of the baby goats in the pajamas Arya had made. These are adorable promotional material, even if no one actually purchases goat PJs. They browsed a bit longer, then stepped to the next booth. The whole thing was covered in fake flowers, woven into unique-looking charms and wall hangings, and even things to wear. A bubbly young woman, who was wearing a headband made of purple flowers, with ribbons flowing down her back, bounced over. Hello. I'm Minnie, which is short for Minerva. You look like one of the Westons. Are you? She peered at Artie, but didn't give her a chance to answer. You look like Athena, but you're not. Oh well, welcome to my booth. Would you like some flowers? Chuckling at her enthusiasm, Wyatt looked around. I'm not sure this is the right place for me. Do you see anything you'd like? He asked Artie. Someone named Minerva sounds like she'd get on well with your family. She was eyeing a display of barrettes. Athena's my younger sister. These really are pretty. You make them all yourself? Yep. Minnie declared. In fact, if you don't see something you like, I'd be happy to custom make you anything. You can even bring me the flowers you like. Artie smiled. That's okay, she said, reaching for a delicate silver and purple creation. There were tiny flowers surrounded by wire, so the whole thing looked like an intricate butterfly. I'll take this one. Wyatt insisted on paying, but Minnie insisted on being the one to pin it in Artie's hair. It looked as if it had been made especially for her, and the booth owner was beaming as they waved goodbye. The next person to stop them was a woman handing out brochures. Genuine hot springs, she was saying, sounding a little desperate. I'm opening my brand new bed and breakfast here in town, and there are genuine hot springs in the backyard. Really? Artie took a brochure and peered at it. I've never heard of that. The woman, who had paint on her pants and elbows, nodded firmly. No one around here has, or is willing to admit it at least, but I'm determined to get the word out if I want my place to be a success. My name is Misty. Artie introduced Wyatt and herself with a smile, then took the brochure with a little wave. I'll help spread the word. As Misty turned to her next potential customer, Artie smiled up at Wyatt. She seemed nice. He wasn't so sure about the whole hot springs in her backyard thing, but he nodded in agreement. They turned and almost ran into Deck's new family. Auntie Artie, little CJ screamed and threw her arms around Artie's middle. She was holding an ice cream cone, but was smart enough to turn her face at the last moment so as not to smear Artie's dress. After getting hugs, and offering a lick of ice cream, CJ turned to Wyatt with her arms out. Up, Uncle Wyatt, she demanded, sounding as if she were a much younger child. But, chuckling, Wyatt did as she demanded, groaning with pretend effort. Giggling, CJ offered him a lick of her cone, then gasped and pointed. What is that in your hair, Auntie Artie? As her parents listened, Deck looked happy to just be standing there, his arm around his wife, and Wyatt felt a little jealous. Artie explained about Minnie's booth. And she said she'd even make you something custom if you brought her a flower you liked. Okay, you'd better put me down now, Uncle Wyatt, CJ declared. Here, she said, shoving the cone in his hands. I have business. The four adults watched, chuckling, as she skipped over to a clump of wildflowers along the fence. After great deliberation, she picked a small daisy and held it up, beaming. Come on, Mama. CJ skipped back over to take Decker's hand. Daddy, we have to hurry, or she'll be busy. Smiling, they trooped back to Minnie's booth. Little CJ ran up, holding the daisy out, and Wyatt expected the young woman to take it. Instead, she screamed. "Is that a real flower?" She waved her arms. "Oh, no, no, no. I don't do real flowers. Much too allergic. They're full of pollen and dirt and germs." Surprised, Wyatt shook his head. "Yeah, they're flowers. I prefer fake ones," Minnie sniffed. "I don't do yucky things like real flowers." Artie squinted. "Would you, say, lick your fingers just because these two gentlemen happen to be cauldrons?" "Don't be disgusting." Bobby interrupted them. "CJ, baby, why don't you just pick a headband made from fake flowers? It'll last longer." Leaving Deck's family to pick out the little girl's new accessory, Wyatt led Artie away. She was staring over her shoulder at Minnie. "What a strange woman." Wyatt snorted. "Yeah, but let's forget her. The baking arena is up ahead, and Griselda brought her famous cupcakes." But on the way to Griselda's booth, they pulled up short when Jack stepped in their path. Wyatt had to resist the urge to drop Artie's hand, or to, even worse, push her behind him, as if he were protecting her from her own brother. "We're not doing anything wrong." Just because Jax had forbid them from dating for so long, it didn't mean they couldn't now. So Wyatt lifted his chin, pulled her up close against him, and met his best friend's eyes. "Hey, man, how you been?" Jax's gaze dropped to Wyatt's arm around his sister's shoulders, then he raised a brow and made a little humming sound. Before Wyatt could confront him, the other man nodded politely, then simply said, "Good. Looks like you're doing okay too. Have fun." Jax nodded again, then stepped around them and ambled off toward Artisan's Row. Releasing a breath, Wyatt glanced down at Artie, who burst into chuckles. "Cupcakes?" she asked. "Cupcakes," he agreed. Griselda was thrilled to see them. "Oh, I have some chocolate ones you have to try. CJ helped me yesterday, and I swear, that child could drop an egg from a chicken's butt." "What does that mean?" Artie asked. "Where else would she get an egg?" "The refrigerator," the older woman said in exasperation. "But I just meant she's even clumsier than me, if possible." With a grin, Wyatt leaned in to take the chocolate cupcake she offered. "Impossible," he said, with a charming grin and a wink, as he kissed Griselda on the cheek. "Oh, you," she stammered, blushing as she waved them away. "That one's on the house." But Wyatt was reaching for his wallet. "I want a half-dozen of your best." "Well, that's certainly doable, oh. Mr. Cunningham." Wyatt looked around, confused. A tall young man, who'd just walked up and was staring in shock at Griselda, looked just as baffled. Yes?" Griselda was already beckoning him over. "Wyatt, this is Micah Cunningham, he manages the hotel." "Micah, this is one of Robert Cauldron's grandsons, Wyatt, and don't you dare lick your fingers." Poor Micah rolled his eyes as he shook Wyatt's offered hand. Wyatt couldn't tell if he was a local who thought the superstition was dumb, or if he'd never heard of it. Griselda rummaged around for something and mumbled to herself. "Where did I put it? It was just here, on top of the cooler. Oh, I swear I'd lose my own head. Chicken butt? Does the girl not know where eggs come from? Chicken butt, indeed, aha." Wyatt and Artie were both grinning by the time Griselda held up a fancy-looking cupcake, piled high with elaborate red icing. "Here you go, dear," she announced, presenting it to Micah with a flourish. "This is for you. On the house." The man blinked as he reached for the dessert. "I'm sorry, but, do I know you?" "Oh, I'm the sort who gets to know everyone in town, dearie." Griselda beamed. "Eat your cupcake." Micah glanced at Wyatt, as if Wyatt knew what was going on. He shrugged. "She really is, but she means well. Her cupcakes are the best around." Artie leaned in, her mouth full, and chocolate crumbs dotted her lips. "I really are delicious," she mumbled around her cupcake. Shrugging, Micah took a bite of the red frosted cupcake, and Griselda beamed. "Excellent. Wyatt, I'll have a half-dozen of my best boxed up for you, come back later." "Micah, dearie, Can I put you down for a half dozen too? The hotel manager was looking much like a deer in the headlights, so, grinning, Wyatt tugged Artie away from the baking arena and left the poor guy to muddle through on his own. Delicately wiping the crumbs from her lips, Artie raised her brows. Where to now? Well, my favorite part of the summer fair has always been the games. Wanna go check out the ping-pong booth and marvel at my skills? Snorting, she dropped her hands to her hips, and he loved the sassy little tilt to her head. How about you marvel at my skills? Artemis Weston, he gasped, did you just challenge me to a test of skills when it comes to carnival games? I most certainly did. He grinned and grabbed her hand, tugging her toward the games. You're on. Chapter 9. It turned out there were a lot of games at Caudron Valley Church's summer fair. And most of them were downright ridiculous. Artie and Wyatt started simple at the ping-pong booth. She expected something like tossing ping-pong balls into cups to win prizes, and that game was there as well, but there was also one where you had to catch a ping-pong ball in your mouth, and another where you had to bounce it off a series of miniature trampolines and land it in a cup. Wyatt kicked her butt at all of them. So how about those skills, He smirked as he handed the prize back to the booth keeper, having already explained he had no need for yet another plush banana on a stick. Artie rolled her eyes. You clearly have more experience. I've never tried any of those games before, and I haven't even touched a ping-pong ball in years. Plus, you refuse to try the one where you catch it in your mouth. That's how germs are spread, Wyatt. He grinned. It is pretty gross. With a huff, Artie threw up her hands. My point is, I'm totally going to redeem myself at the next booth, as long as I don't have to lick something everyone else has. Chuckling, Wyatt led her to the dunk tank, where she managed to dunk Pastor Dinkelheimler 3 times out of 5, which beat his 2 times. Then they tried the ring toss, where they tied, and although she was eyeing the archery but set up, he tugged her in the direction of the eating contests. The first one was a pie-eating contest, but she shook her head. I'm still full from that cupcake. A cupcake made you full? I think you're just chickening out, he teased. How about spaghetti? Do you like spaghetti? Her eyes narrowed. Only a complete pumpkinhead doesn't like spaghetti, at least on some level. Is there extra garlic? No, but there's candy. While she was trying to figure out what he meant, he called out to the booth tender, 2 for the spaghetti challenge, Mrs. Papalopodowski. The older woman's eyes widened when she realized who had spoken, and she stuck her fingers in her mouth and lifted them. But Wyatt wasn't offended. Oh, Mrs. Papalopodowski. You're going to have to move faster than that if you want to win the Cursed Cauldron's Fingers in the Air contest. What? She quavered. Oh, that's the contest I'm running at the fair, he said with a shrug. It's a moving contest. I'm timing how fast people can lick their fingers and stick them in the air. Artie knew she shouldn't laugh, but the old woman looked so confused as she lowered her fingers to her tongue once more, that it was impossible not to giggle just a bit. With her hand in front of her mouth to hide her smile, Artie managed, I'm not touching her spaghetti unless she puts on a glove. Luckily, there were gloves, and after Wyatt got Mrs. Poppy Doppy whatever her name was going, she scooped out 2 servings of spaghetti onto 2 plates and dropped a handful of peanut M&Ms on top. Now, Wyatt said, leading Artie to a long table after handing the old lady 2 of their tickets. Sit here, with your hands behind your back. Okay. Artie followed his instructions and watched as he did the same. Smiling, he leaned over the plate of spaghetti, his hands behind his back. Using only your mouth, or face, you have to get all the M&Ms in a pile off your plate. We each have 6 pieces of candy, so the first person to get them all in one place wins. It sounded disgusting. It sounded ridiculous. It sounded fun. Without waiting for him to give her the starting countdown, Artie plopped herself face first into the spaghetti, rooting like a pig for the M&Ms beside her. She heard Wyatt yell, "Cheater," before he attacked his own spaghetti. She was laughing too hard to really focus, especially once she realized Wyatt's method of sorting noodle from candy was to eat the spaghetti as he went. She found her first 2 M&Ms and pushed them off to the side in the time it took him to eat half his plate. It didn't help that he kept taking a break to yell things like, "Use your tongue, Artie," and, "Yeah, really get in there." Needless to say, he won, but only because she gave up halfway through, laughing too hard to continue. Still, he was crowing about his victory as he handed her a towel to clean the sauce off her face, and she immediately challenged him to another contest. Smirking, he agreed, but when they stepped up to the marshmallow on a string booth, he winced. "I've always sucked at this, Artie." "Excellent." She was the one to hand the tickets over, and when the man who took them licked his fingers and shoved them in the air, she turned to Wyatt, who looked impressed. "Melvin, you're a strong contender in the Cursed Cauldron's Fingers in the Air contest." What?" the poor man asked, confused. "Nothing, just set up the marshmallows," Wyatt said, with a sigh. Artie grinned when she saw the challenge. Large marshmallows hung from strings, which were attached to poles. You had to chase your marshmallow around, looking like an idiot as you went. "Ready, go," Wyatt declared, then lunged for his marshmallow. The thing bounced off his nose, and with a growl, he went after it. His tongue swept out, pushing it even further away. Artie didn't bother hiding her giggle, and he turned to her with a scowl. "And you can do better?" With a flourish, she held the stick vertical, so the marshmallow hung straight down. Then she lifted it above her head, tilted her head back, and lowered the marshmallow neatly into her mouth. "Ta-da," she declared. Although, since her mouth was full of marshmallow, it came out as AAA. He smiled at her in a way which made her insides turn all squishy. "You really are remarkable, Artemis Weston," he said, in a soft voice. To hide her flushed pleasure at the compliment, she grabbed his hand and pulled him to the next booth. This was an ice water challenge where they had to stand in a baby pool of ice water and pick up marbles with their toes, and they tied at 7 in the minute and a half they had before their feet turned to popsicles and they had to climb out. Then they did a wild contest where they each wore shower caps covered in shaving cream and had to throw Cheetos at one another's head to see who could get the most to stick. It was loads of fun and actually required them to work together, so there wasn't a clear winner. Laughing, she pulled the cap off her head and handed it to the attendant to clean. "That was fun. I think I prefer working with you, instead of against you." "Me too," he said softly, taking her hand. "So I have just the thing." They were just in time to enter the three-legged race. Kate and Jamie entered, but with their height difference, Wyatt said they didn't have a chance. Jim and Joy were the couple to beat, and once Wyatt explained the Cursed Cauldron's Fingers in the Air contest, they started egging on the locals as well. When the attendant, who hadn't dropped his hand yet, and thus was a winner in the Cursed Cauldron's Fingers in the Air contest, as far as Artie was concerned, blew his whistle, they were off. Kate and Jamie fell over almost immediately, as did a few others, but when Wyatt put his arm around her, Artie stopped worrying about everyone else and focused on him. She wrapped her arm around his middle and concentrated on his breathing and the way he moved. Letting him take the lead, she moved when he did, and soon they had a rhythm going. They reached the opposite side of the field, and while turning was a little problematic, were already headed back to the starting point by the time Jim and Joy reached them. He was yelling things which were making Joy crack up, so Artie didn't think they were serious about winning anyhow. Sure enough, Artie and Wyatt won easily, and he made a big deal out of accepting the prize, one of Minnie's fake flower garlands, which he draped around his own neck like a prize racehorse, while Artie guffawed. It was an incredible feeling, to be teamed up with him, and her laughter suddenly stopped when she realized she wanted to be teamed up with him forever. "I mean, not in a three-legged race, but we work wonderfully together." They complimented one another and meshed in a way she'd never experienced before. Wyatt would be her partner in every way, she knew it. Contemplating that got them through the lawn chair volleyball game they'd joined, which was far less relaxing than he'd made it out to be, and the tug-of-war contest. Unfortunately, the two of them were put on a team with Ted and Caroline, and the rest of their team spent so much time licking their fingers and shoving them into the air, they quickly lost. "You're all finalists in the Cursed Cauldron's Fingers in the Air contest," Wyatt hollered good-naturedly, and Artie and Caroline snickered as Ted pretended to write down the scores. This could be my forever. She could happily spend the rest of her life teasing Wyatt about the superstitions, and being surrounded by a big family like the Cauldrons. But how? Wyatt signed them up for a relay race, which involved passing Lifesavers candy from person to person via a toothpick you had to carry in between your teeth. It looked hilarious, and Artie winced when she saw Bob stab Tessa in the cheek with his toothpick. But when it was their turn, and Artie had her hand behind her back, ready to accept the candy, Wyatt waggled his brows at her suggestively, and she cracked up. He leaned in close to pass off the candy, and she realized there was something she wanted more than winning. She spat out the toothpick, leaned in and pulled his toothpick out of his mouth, dropping it and the candy on the ground. He didn't have time to say more than, "Hey," before her mouth pressed into his. He tasted of the cherry candy, and from the way he groaned and grabbed her hips to pull her closer, he didn't mind losing the chance at another fake garland at all. They were both breathing heavily when they pulled apart. But Artie's blood was humming, as if there was still something she needed to do. She wasn't sure how to do it, but all she knew was that now, today, she had the chance to change her future for the better. And she wanted to embrace that opportunity. Her eyes lit on the archery butts, which were empty at that moment. "I challenge you," she blurted out. "I know we work great together, but one more contest, me against you." "You're on," he said with a lazy grin, following her gaze. "I'm not bad with a bow and arrow." Laughing, she tugged him onward. But I'm named after Artemis, goddess of the moon and the hunt." "And do you know what she hunted with?" he groaned as he took a bow from the attendant. "A bow and arrow?" "Yes." She grinned. "Let's see what you've got." Unfortunately, what he got turned out to be a lot. He was almost as good a shot as she was. But then, if this were easy, it wouldn't be a risk. After their second round, she took a deep breath and lowered her weapon to meet his eyes. "This is fun, but let's make it more interesting." His brows rose. "A wager? You want to make a wager with me?" Her heart was pounding, and her palms were sweaty enough she had to wipe one down the side of her dress. But she nodded. His eyes narrowed as he studied her. "What are the stakes?" She swallowed. "Simple ones. If you win, nothing changes." "And if you win?" he asked quietly. "Here goes. You have to marry me." Never in his life had Wyatt felt the way he did now. Oh, sure, he'd experienced the heart-pounding anticipation, combined with the constant arousal and breathless excitement, especially when it came to Artemis Weston. But there was something else mixed in right now, and he frowned, trying to understand it. His entire life, he'd had this sixth sense when it came to wagers. He always knew if he could win them or not. And right now, he was getting that signal. He could win this wager, no problem. She was a good shot, maybe even a better shot, but he knew if he tried it right now, he would beat her and win. But, did he want to? For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure he wanted to win a wager. So he stalled. "Marry you? You want to marry me?" She was pretty when she smiled, but Wyatt loved how kissable she looked when she blushed like that. He also loved the way she didn't demur, but lifted her chin and met his eyes. "I've wanted to marry you for almost half my life, Wyatt Cauldron. I used to think I loved you, back when we were both young, and I had this crush on you. I used to dream about becoming Mrs. Wyatt Cauldron." One corner of her lips tugged upward. "But the last few weeks, getting to know the real you, I realized I was wrong." He swallowed. "You realized you didn't love me?" She held his gaze and shook her head, tapping the bow against her leg. "I realized I didn't know you well enough to love you. I realized what I felt for you was a foolish infatuation. I realized there was no way I could have understood how passionate, how funny, how caring you can be, back then. It took actually being with you, and spending time with you, to realize the truth." "And what is that?" he whispered, stepping closer to her. She held his gaze. "I love you the way I'll never love another person, Wyatt. The love I've carried for you for years was strong, yes, but this is forever." There was a band around his chest, squeezing his heart tighter with each beat. He felt as if she were saying the words he'd thought for years, but he couldn't seem to make his mouth work to agree with her. She'd wagered their future on a game of archery, a game he could win. But in that moment, he knew he wouldn't. Because if he beat her at that contest, he'd lose the overall goal. So he nodded. She looked as if she were holding her breath. Wyatt? Why wasn't his voice working properly? I accept, he managed, in a hoarse whisper. And her expression turned to a mixture of anticipation and worry. He knew the feeling. She nodded once, then turned and stepped up to the firing line. She took a deep breath and reached for an arrow to nock. As she pulled back the string, Wyatt felt his heart hammering in his chest. She was so damn beautiful, standing there in that silvery gray dress, her legs braced, and her head cocked to one side to sight down the shaft of the arrow. She looked like a goddess of the hunt. When she released the arrow, they exhaled together. And when it hit the center of the target, they both nodded. As if they both agreed this was the way the world should be. Silently, she stepped away from the firing line, so he could step up. His pulse was thumping against the inside of his temples so hard, he felt like his head was swimming, but he forced himself to breathe as he took her place. He nocked his arrow and pulled it back. Then he glanced at her. She was standing there, her hands clasped in front of her, looking adorable and sexy and terrified and certain, all at once. And he knew. He loved her. He loved her, and he'd never lost a wager before. But he was about to. He didn't bother sighting along the arrow shaft, but dropped the tip a few degrees. He released the string, and the arrow barely made it half the distance to the target, before plowing into the grass. He'd missed entirely. Whoops, he muttered, for the look of things. When he turned back to her, she'd lifted her hands in front of her mouth, so he couldn't see if she were smiling. But her eyes, there were tears in them. Artemis? Did you just? She shook her head, as if she couldn't bring herself to ask the question. Are you sure? He dropped his bow beside hers, nodded to the attendant, then took Artie's elbow and led her off to one side, into the shadows of one of the buildings. When she stumbled, he caught her and didn't let her go. Instead, he kept his hands on her hips as he turned her to face him. You don't have to do it, she blurted, her hands clasped in front of her breasts. It was a stupid wager, Wyatt, and you don't have to marry me. His lips silenced her silly objections. He wasn't certain what she was feeling at that moment, but as far as he was concerned, this kiss was full of joy and anticipation. She was going to be his. Forever. When they broke apart, he pressed his forehead to hers. Artemis Weston, I've loved you for years. Getting to know you these last weeks have been the best thing that ever happened to me. I will gladly marry you and spend the rest of my life proving that taking that wager was the best thing I ever did. The noise which escaped her lips was somewhere between a sob and a laugh. When he pulled back to peer down at her, she was smiling, but there were tears in her eyes. But all she said was, which wager? He chuckled. Jax's wager and yours. If you agree to marry me, Artie, I can't be mad at him for that bet. I'll have to thank him for setting me up with the woman of my dreams, even if he didn't realize it. Her arm snaked around his shoulders. Listen, mister, I asked you to marry me. So you'd better agree to marry me. His lips pulled into a smile so big, he thought his face might burst. I 100%, unequivocally agree. I will marry you, Artie, because that was the bet. She hummed. And you lost. I never lose a wager. You did today, Wyatt Cauldron. You lost a wager to me. Chuckling, he lowered his lips to hers. She gave a sexy little moan and pressed against him, tightening her hold in a way which pressed them flush against one another. He slid his palms up her sides, reveling in the way her slim curves molded to him, before wrapping his arms around her. It was so easy to forget they were in public, when his palms itched to cup her, to touch her in ways which would really make her moan. With a gasp, she pulled apart. When? What? When can we get married? Because I feel like I've been waiting a decade to feel your hands on me, to know how good we could be together, and if you don't marry me as soon as possible, I'm not sure I'll be able to stand it. It was amazing how alike they thought sometimes. My brothers and cousins arranged their weddings pretty quickly, he said, with a small shrug. We could probably be married in a week or so. Not soon enough, she declared, shaking her head. But, don't you want the fancy dress and the flowers, and your family there? She stepped back, reaching for his hand with one of hers. As she smoothed her other palm down her dress, he ached to touch her. What kind of dress would I wear that would be better than this one? She asked. And we already have flowers. She pointed to her hair, and the garland Wyatt still wore. And no, I love my family, but frankly, I'm my own woman. I don't need their permission to get on with my life, and I know they'll be happy for me. He squinted. So when you said you wanted to get married as soon as possible, what you're saying is? She grinned. What are you doing this afternoon? Chapter 10. They got married that afternoon. Artie felt as if she were flying, surely her feet weren't on the ground as she signed the papers and provided the requirements to marry. But then, she and Wyatt were standing before a judge, and he was smiling, and they were smiling, and when Wyatt kissed her, she thought he might have been crying. She certainly was. They'd taken his Jeep downtown, and once they were wed, they climbed back in. He was gripping the steering wheel, staring straight ahead, and her hand shook as she stared at the papers which declared them to be legally husband and wife. Forever. I can't believe we just did that, she whispered. Jax is going to be so angry, he agreed. The thought didn't bother her as much as she'd once guessed it might. Smiling, she caught his gaze. Is it weird that I really don't care? A laugh burst out of him as he reached over and took her hand. At this point, I don't think I care either. I finally got what I've always wanted. She winked. And all it took was losing a wager. More than one. He winced. I bet my brothers I wouldn't be married before the annual rodeo. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm not, he whispered back. It was a wonderfully sweet moment, but anticipation filled the air. So, what now? He smiled and dropped her hand to reach for the keys. Are you hungry? After all that spaghetti? Not really. He peeled out of the parking lot and headed for the ranch. Well then, I know where we can get some snackies. They were both still laughing when he carried her over the threshold to his apartment. The new furniture had been delivered already, but it looked as though he hadn't set a lot of it up yet. There were boxes and wrappings, and she didn't get to see the rest, because he carried her right into the bedroom and dropped her on the bed. Scrambling backwards, she propped herself up on her elbows as he reached for her foot. Wyatt? What are you doing? With an air of determination, he frowned over her sandals. I'm undressing my wife. My wife. Oh my. He got the first sandal off, then reached for her second one. She pulled her foot out of his reach. When he frowned up at her, she saw the desire, the need in his expression. Why don't you let your wife take care of undressing herself, and you focus on getting your hot butt out of your own clothes? He blinked, then his expression slowly turned to pleasure. As you wish. The line from The Princess Bride had them both chuckling, and she sat up to fumble out of her dress, as he pulled his shirt over his head. Her mouth went dry when she finally, saw her husband nude for the first time, but it was absolutely the best feeling. Her whole body was already throbbing with need, and from the way he looked at her, like a big cat stalking its prey, as he crawled under the covers with her, she knew he felt it too. His mouth was everywhere, making her ache in the most delicious ways. His fingers were on her, then in her, preparing her and still leaving her wanting. I've waited so long for this. When he finally entered her, they both froze, although she wasn't certain if it was to allow her body to accommodate him, or if they were both in shock. Artemis, he groaned, hiding his face in the crook of her neck. I don't want to hurt you. But then he moved, just slightly, and she gasped. Her arms went around his neck and her thighs opened wider, and she pulled him in more. Do that again, husband. So he did. They moved together, the pleasure building between them. And when he stiffened and shouted her name, her own ecstasy exploded around him. Panting, they both collapsed on the mattress. That was better than I could possibly have expected. Lying there, tangled in her husband's arms, Artie began to giggle. In a moment, he was chuckling too. Then he surprised her by rolling her over, until he was pinning her. "Why are we laughing, wife?" She smiled up at him. "Because we're so incredibly happy, husband." He dropped a kiss to her nose, then a softer one against the corner of her mouth. "I've been waiting to touch you for years, Artemis Weston Cauldron. I should have gone slower for our first time together, so we could have really enjoyed it." She wriggled beneath him, his words already stirring arousal again. "I enjoyed it plenty. Didn't you?" His chuckle was a little dry, as his lips trailed down her jaw to her neck. "Oh, I enjoyed it. Couldn't you tell?" Sighing, she tilted her head, so he'd have better access, the familiar ache settling between her legs once more. "I think," she sucked in a breath as his lips reached her nipple. "I think that was absolutely amazing. We're never going to top it." He was grinning when he lifted his head, that familiar, mischievous gleam showing brightly in his green eyes. "Wanna bet?" It was a wager she gladly lost. "Well, young man, I can't say I'm not surprised you decided to do everything backward, but I want you to know your grandmother would be happy for you, if she were here today." Grams would be happy. Wyatt had always made her life difficult, he knew, but he also knew that she loved him, despite his challenges, and wanted the best for him. Not only that, he was pretty certain she'd known about the torch he'd carried for Artie for so long. And judging from Artie's story about the lasagna, it seemed like Grams had told Griselda. In a way, Grams had helped bring them together again, so, throat tight with emotion, Wyatt just nodded to his grandfather. "And," Pop said gruffly, dropping his hand to his pig's head, where the huge animal sat beside his chair, "Herman and I are happy for you too. All we ever wanted was for you to be happy, Wyatt." "You and the pig wanted me to be happy?" When Pop scowled and rolled his eyes, Artie made a little exasperated noise and slapped Wyatt's arm. "Are you sure you want to be married to this irreverent fool, Artemis?" Pops asked. He never could take anything seriously. "Oh, I don't know." She caressed the arm she'd just slapped. "I think he's rather good at taking things seriously. Things which matter, at least." Wyatt didn't need her defense, not when he was just teasing his grandfather. But he sent her a grateful smile, knowing she loved him. Pops made a little snorting noise, which Herman echoed, only louder. "Sounds like you found a woman who appreciates you, boy." "Yes, sir." Wyatt twined his fingers with hers. "And I appreciate her." In the week since they'd told Pops and her parents about their secret wedding, the news had spread. She'd already moved her stuff into his apartment, and together they set up the rest of his new furniture and started redecorating the place. They'd had lots of important conversations as well. Artie had already set up an interview with Doc Phillips, although she hadn't yet quit her job in Black Aces. She still had a lot of clients in the other town, but Doc Phillips had promised to start spreading her name and contact info to his patients, assuming he followed through with offering Artie the job as his assistant, and there was no reason why he wouldn't. Wyatt was confident she'd be able to switch jobs without much hassle. For now, she was driving back and forth to Black Aces each morning. They'd talked about getting rid of her camper van, but decided to hold on to it for now, since it was nice to be able to go off-grid for getaways. Over the weekend, they'd driven it up to the ridge and had camped, and Wyatt decided he really liked being able to make love to her out in the crisp Montana night air. Maybe one day, there'd be babies, and they'd have to think about moving into someplace bigger than a one-room apartment, and upgrading to a full RV. But for now, the two of them were in no hurry. They were making up for lost time, having spent a decade aching for one another. They were determined to enjoy one another now, without having to worry about babies for a bit longer. Artie interrupted his thoughts when she leaned forward. "Thank you, Mr. Cauldron, for hosting my family tonight. Even if all of my siblings can't be here, there's still a lot of us, and I appreciate you being willing." Pops waved away her thanks. "Call me Pops, young lady. All my other new granddaughters do. And Griselda nearly had a conniption when she found out you two got married without a party. She's been baking for days, ever since I agreed to host a celebration dinner." He smiled fondly. "We have to celebrate, after all." I went into the kitchen earlier, and she shooed me out, Wyatt offered. That's because she knew I wanted to speak with you, Pop said, with a fond smile. I swear, that woman is overbearing, clumsy as all get out, and an outrageous flirt, but she sure does love every one of you boys. And Pop's too, Wyatt would wager, but he kept his mouth shut. She's a good cook too, Artie added. That too, Pops agreed. Wyatt stood up from the couch, still holding Artie's hand. Well, I've got something to give my wife, if you're done giving me hell about how long it took me to get around to getting married, and about how delinquent I am, and how I should have just seen what was in front of my face this whole time. I never said any of that. Pop sputtered. Wyatt winked. You didn't have to. No, I guess you've said it all for me. The old man scowled. Can't even give you a right talking to, without you figuring you've got me pegged. Well, I do, don't I? That's what you were thinking, wasn't it? Pop's scowl deepened, and he crossed his arms without replying. Chuckling, Wyatt went to pull Artie to her feet, but was stopped by the rest of his family stepping into the room. Not so fast, Wyatt, Bob said with a huge grin on his face. Yeah, Kate agreed. There's a little matter we need to talk to you about. With a groan, Wyatt plopped back down on the couch. Say, Ted, Jim ventured, crossing his arms in front of his chest, I'm not so good with math, but it's not yet September, is it? Chuckling, Ted shook his head. Not even close, so that would mean Wyatt got married before the September rodeo, didn't he? Wyatt scowled, knowing Jim was playing dumb just to prove a point. Yes-sirree, Ted agreed, with a big smile. Deck hummed as he drifted into the room. And that would mean Wyatt lost his bet with us, wouldn't it? You mean the one where he matched each of us $1,000, which said he wouldn't get married before the rodeo? Kate asked with a smirk. Yep. I do believe that's what that means. Scowling, Wyatt threw up his hands. I knew you lot wouldn't let me forget that. Bob whistled. The man sacrificed $5,000 just to marry the woman he loved. Wyatt froze, a frown tugging at his lips. What do you mean? Deck shrugged. You could have easily held out until September and won our bet. But then he would have lost the far more important wager. Wyatt's hand dropped to Artie's. She wrapped her fingers through his and squeezed. When he looked at her, she smiled. No, I couldn't, he whispered, and knew she understood. Taking a deep breath, he stood, pulling her to her feet. I'll write you all checks tomorrow morning when the bank opens. Never thought I'd see the day Wyatt Cauldron would lose a wager, murmured Jim. He'd lost 2 wagers the day he deliberately missed that archery target, and Wyatt didn't mind one bit. So he grinned his usual cocky smile and winked at his brothers and cousins. I'm a different man, fellows. Now, if you'll excuse me. As he tugged his wife out of the room, he heard the chuckles and conversation start up behind him, but all he cared about was getting her outside. They still had 15 minutes or so before her family was supposed to show up, and that gave him just enough time. What was it you wanted to give me? She asked, as he shut the front door behind them. Out on the porch, they had plenty of space, but he still tugged her flush up against him. In a moment, he murmured, before his lips claimed hers. Would there ever be a time when this woman wouldn't fire his blood? A time when she wouldn't respond to him so ardently? A time where just her scent wouldn't make him want to throw her over his shoulder and drag her off someplace to make sweet love to her? Wyatt doubted it. She tasted like forever. The sound of a throat clearing behind him finally drew them apart. Dazed, Wyatt tugged her around, and when he saw Jack standing there with his arms crossed and his expression carefully blank, Wyatt resisted the urge to jump away from Artie. Instead, he kept his arm around her as they faced her brother together. Slowly, Jax climbed the stairs, eyeing the two of them. Mom told me the news last week, he finally said, stopping on the top step. There wasn't anything in his expression or tone to tell Wyatt what he was thinking, and he hated the thought of losing his best friend over something like this. So he cleared his throat. I'm sorry I didn't tell you myself. Jax raised a brow at his sister. You could have done it too, Artemis. To Wyatt's surprise, Artie snorted and rolled her eyes. After all the times my big brother, Ajax the Great, forbade me from seeing his best friend? You knew how much I liked Wyatt, Jax. The other man was shaking his head. You know I hate that name, and yeah, I did know. His gaze slowly turned to Wyatt. And I had an idea you might like Artie. You asked about her often enough. Swallowing, Wyatt nodded silently, admitting to his best friend what he hadn't been able to confess before. To his surprise, Jax's expression broke into a grin. So why in the heck do you think I made that bet in the first place, man? As Wyatt blinked, Jax stepped up onto the porch, opening his arms wide. He clasped one hand on Artie's shoulder, and the other on Wyatt's shoulder, bracketing the two of them. I'm sorry for my part in keeping the two of you apart. For a long time, I didn't realize what you could mean to one another, and I'm glad you had the chance to figure it out. Then he pulled them both into a hug, and when Artie wrapped her free arm around her brother, Wyatt did the same. Jax pounded him on his back, then pulled away with a smile. I love you both. Artie sounded a little choked up when she whispered, love you too, big brother. But Wyatt forced a scowl. I'm still angry at you. Smiling, Jax stepped back with a nonchalant shrug and charming grin. Maybe, but you also owe me for finally getting your butt in gear. He nodded to them both, then headed for the front door. No need to thank me. I'll show myself in. As he disappeared into the house, Artie turned to Wyatt, a dazed grin on her face. I can't believe he set this whole thing up. Wyatt was still scowling after his friend. I'm not certain he did. Maybe he's just taking credit for it now, because it turned out all right. She took his hand. Just all right, she teased. Besides, I know my brother. It wouldn't surprise me to learn he'd been planning this for ages. With a sigh, Wyatt had to admit she was right. Fine, but I'm not going to admit I'm grateful to him or anything. She giggled. Me neither. Let's pretend like we're holding a grudge. Now he had to chuckle. You have a devious mind, wife. Want to help me set up the wagers for the rodeo in September? You're on. She poked him in the side. Now, before the rest of my family shows up, and before I start kissing you again, what was that thing you wanted to give me? Greedy little thing, aren't you? He chuckled as he reached in his pocket for his phone. What can I say? I like surprises. Well, you're going to like this one, I hope. Wyatt flicked through his photos, found the one he wanted, and turned the phone to face her. With a squeal, she yanked it from his hands. OMG, he's adorable. It's a he, right? How old is he? Chuckling, Wyatt stepped up behind her and wrapped his arms around his wife's middle. He rested his chin on her shoulder and peered down at the photo of the adorable baby hound dog on the screen. He's a he. He's about 5 weeks old, so we have a few weeks to get the apartment ready for him. He felt her stiffen as she caught her breath. He's ours? Yes, ma'am, Mrs. Cauldron. I knew one of the hands had a bitch who'd whelped, so I asked him. He gave me the pick of the litter, and I picked out that little one for you. Since I knew you missed Cerberus. When she turned in his arms, he saw tears in her eyes. I hope that's okay, he asked, suddenly nervous he'd made the wrong decision. But she smiled. It's better than okay. I think it's one of the sweetest things anyone's ever done for me. What should we name him? Wyatt relaxed, content with her in his arms. What do you think? Should we go with the Greek mythology theme? Are there any other dog names? I have a better idea, she murmured, pushing herself up on her toes. The movement caused all sorts of interesting body parts to push against him, and he suddenly found it hard to concentrate. Oh, yeah, he whispered, his attention on her lips. How about we name him Wager? They grinned at the same time. Right before their lips touched, he murmured, Wife, you've got yourself a deal.